session. We speak today about regional cooperation in the Western Balkans, and we have here three distinguished speakers, Mr. Dimitar Becer, Mr. Janez Kopač, and Mr. Julian Popov. So we can start immediately, and I give the floor to Mr. Dimitar Becer for his speech. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And before I start, let me extend my warmest thanks to NATO Parliamentary Assembly and the Rose-Roth seminars for having me here. It's an excellent opportunity to be with you in the beautiful city of Belgrade to discuss the region. Now, let me open by a short introduction or a short intervention by just underlining once more that in the Western Balkans, regional cooperation has been a success story. Of course, over the years, many people, me included, in the policy world, in political life, have complained about the difficulties of working together, especially in the wake of the Yugoslav wars of the 1990s. People have highlighted the poor interconnectivity of the region, how long it takes to travel between the capital cities here, misunderstandings, suspicions, competition. But overall, looking back over a period of 15, 20 years, you can safely say that in the Western Balkans, regional cooperation is a relative success. It has made important inroads. There is no easier way to prove the point by looking at the region in comparison to other areas on the edges of the European Union. If you look at the Eastern Partnership countries, where you have a multilateral dimension, the Caucasus, but also in North Africa, EU, which is of course the main actor pushing for regional cooperation, but also NATO, have put efforts to encourage the countries to work together as a way to overcome conflicts and strengthen economic interdependence and cooperation in various security matters. But the Western Balkans stand out in terms of advancements. There is no need right now to go over the alphabet soup of various regional institutions. Starting from 1999, when the Stability Pact was established, now we have the Regional Cooperation Council. Mr. Golan Svilanovic will be addressing you later today, so he will be giving you more of a flavor of what the Regional Cooperation Council does. But there are many more. We are fortunate to have here the head of the energy community as well. The region is really networked in terms of institutions. A lot going on, a lot of interactions, a lot of policy areas covered. And of course the common denominator, why, you might ask, why countries have moved so much in comparison to other states, other regions on the edges of Europe. Of course the common denominator is the mutual or the shared interest in integrating into Euro-Atlantic structures. That's the glue that and the unifying factor has brought together, especially countries in former Yugoslavia. But not only, there is bottom-up. You have lots of personal, institutional links. People speak the same language in this part of the world. And it's been rediscovered now after the memories of conflict are fading. So that's the success story. Now, what I want to underscore or look at in the next few minutes is to draw your attention to several shifts, what has changed in regional cooperation since the early days, around the time of the Kosovo War, when it was conceived. Now, the first important change to my mind is the shift of focus from security to the economy. The Stability Pact, but also the Southeast European cooperation process in the mid and late 90s were about trust building in the wake of Western interventions. They are geared towards reconstruction, re-establishing links, putting formally warring elites and countries around the same table under the Western guise, and using economic tools to strengthen political cooperation. Now I think we are well past this stage. Now the agenda is clearly to do with fostering economic growth and helping countries rebound. That's the reason, the reason behind this shift is also the difficult economic situation in this part of the world. We lived in a very benign environment until 2008 when the economic crisis started, especially when it came to Europe in 2010. All those countries are heavily trading with the Eurozone, very much integrated. For all intents and purposes, they are already part of the European Union as an economic space. Their citizens move visa-free, except for Kosovo, of course. But, of course, that has led to vulnerability. If you compare Western Balkans to other emerging regions, you see that the crisis came more slowly, but it's also more slow to leave, and so the rebound hasn't quite come. Serbia is a good example. It's just signed another standby agreement with the IMF. It implements a program of austerity. It's really a set of economic challenges to face. So regional cooperation, the added value, is a complementary strategy, a way to find ways of growing again. Of course, trading and seeking investment from the core of the Eurozone, the core of the European Union, is the dominant direction in economic policies, but surely there's another level. And that underscores this idea that regional cooperation is now clearly about the economy and what can be gained in terms of fostering growth by trading more, finding investment and economic opportunities with your partners. My second point is that regional cooperation after the crisis, it's not just about EU and NATO anymore. You have many more actors involved from the outside. I understand you discussed the role of Russia yesterday, and clearly Russia found inroads in this part of the world because of the economic downturn. It's only understandable why regional countries seek investment in economic links with outside players, and Russia has a lot to offer in the field of energy. We can discuss the intentions, the political motives behind it, but there is demand for external involvement, and large projects like the failed South Stream was a good example. But the bottom line here is that Russia is also pushing its own regionalization agenda in the region. Similarly, you can look at the role of Turkey. It's been quite active. Of course, Turkey is a very different country compared to Russia because it's part of NATO and it's negotiating membership with the EU. But not only, you have another example of China involved in the region. In December here in Belgrade, you had the annual summit of countries of Central and Eastern Europe together with the Western Balkans, the 16+1. Has become an annual event. It was in Bucharest last year, in 2013, it was in Belgrade 2014, and it's happening on a regular basis. So China is also pushing its regional strategy. And there are others as well. The Gulf has become more important with the big deal to invest into Serbian national air carrier. So it's now because of Emirati money that the region is becoming more interconnected. And that's the point. The Western orientation is there, but there are others helping or advancing regional agendas in addition to the Western institutions. That leads me to my third point. For a long time, we viewed regional cooperation in the Western Balkans as a very much inward-looking affair. It was about the Western Balkans, first and foremost. Now, because you have all those external powers, you understand that the geography of the region is changing. Yes, on the one hand, it's shrinking because Croatia left maybe by the end of the decade or maybe later in early next decade. Montenegro and Serbia will leave the Western Balkans as they join the EU. But equally, it's not about shrinking, it's also about expanding, about open-ended regionalism. Many of those initiatives involve countries that are not in the Western Balkans, but are equally part of the same area. Energy, which we will discuss later on, is a good example, if you talk about the field of energy, you understand that by the term the region, you mean a much wider cluster of countries, including also Bulgaria, Greece, Romania, all the way to Turkey, which yesterday experienced an interesting event, the big blackout. I'm sure that there will be quite a bit of discussion later on the other speakers. So the region is actually opening, and many of those initiatives make sense not as policy schemes focused exclusively on the Western Balkans, based on the formal distinction that these are countries that are candidates for membership in the EU and NATO, and the others are not. The functional logic actually broadens the region, opens it up, and I think it's a more fruitful way to think about regional cooperation. It's also more true to the regional spirit. Let me, by way of paying homage, underscore that actually regional cooperation started in the late 80s with the first meeting of foreign ministers of Balkan countries here in Belgrade, which was then the capital of Yugoslavia. So it was never meant to be an internal, inward-looking Western Balkan affairs. It was always conceived as a larger enterprise. Now, before I close, I want to underscore that the way we think about regional cooperation is not solely about what is out there in terms of institutions and initiatives, but also what is the output, what they have delivered. And the record is very patchy. We have all formal structures, the Regional Cooperation Council is there, but expectations haven't been quite met. The way forward, of course, is to identify key sectors where working together makes lots of sense. And I think the area of energy is clearly one such area. The region is brought together by the fact that it's a transit area for energy flows from places further afield, in the Middle East, the Caspian area, and so on and so forth. So that's a common denominator. The region is also dependent on energy imports. There is quite a bit of indigenous potential to improve and to modernize the energy systems. Energy cooperation can be a really important bit in this regional story, beyond more familiar areas like trade integration through CEFTA, and also security cooperation and cooperation in the area of fighting organized crime and corruption. So I think that will be an interesting area to discuss, and maybe I should stop there with my preliminary remarks and pass it to the other speakers who would have much more kind of insightful knowledge on this area. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for your excellent overview of the situation. And now I leave the floor to Mr. Janez Kopač for his speech.
Okay. Thanks a lot. Hello to everybody. Thanks for inviting me there. I will have a short presentation. Should I sit over there? Or?
No, it's fine if you just give me signs.
Okay, good. So, I'm representing Energy Community. Energy Community is an regional organization which was originally, this is our map. Originally, we were organized exactly 10 years ago, so this year we will have a big anniversary in Vienna in August with many distinguished guests. Perhaps even Ban Ki-moon will come, and Miss Angela Merkel and François Hollande and so on. But it's not to talk about celebrations, but more about the content. So Energy Community was established exactly 10 years ago as a tool to reintegrate Southeastern Europe into wider European space. And it was not many years after the wars were ended, and the form of it was, I can say, a very successful one. So how it is organized? European Union is one party of the energy community, and I can say this is the only international organization where European Union is talking with only one voice, because they are represented by Commission, not by member states. And all the other contracting parties, which are now colored yellow, you can see at that time they were a little bit different. There was also Croatia, Romania, Bulgaria, but every country that enters EU ceased to be member of energy community individually, because EU is a member. And later in 2011 we got also Moldova and Ukraine. Now Georgia is becoming full-fledged member, and Turkey, Norway, Armenia being observers currently. So if you can go a little bit on. When this was established, the basic goals were how to attract investments into this region and how to create an integrated energy market with EU. This would of course enhance security of supply, improve the environmental situation because of many coal thermal power plants, and it would enhance competition on the regional level because it would open very closed national energy markets. So, and the tool how to make it, if you can go on, was to establish an organization which has its own acquis, so its own legal framework. About it a little bit later. And when the fathers of our organization were creating this, they copied EU institutions. So we have Ministerial Council as European Union has its Ministerial Council. We have Permanent High-Level Group like European Union has COREPER. We have Regulatory Board which EU has ACER. But the functions and the competencies are approximately similar. We have Secretariat in Vienna, which I represent. European Union has a commission in Brussels. We have fora, electricity forum, gas forum, oil forum. Oil forum is called Belgrade Forum because it is always organized in Belgrade every year. And we have also judicial function. So we have also dispute settlement procedure. We can start infringement procedure against our member states if they do not respect Energy Community Treaty obligations, like Commission can start infringement procedures against EU member states. So the design was how to somehow copy-paste EU model into a wider EU or European neighborhood. And perhaps the instrument was, as I said, or is a transposition of some European rules into this wider space. And so we have, European Union has hundreds of directives on all possible areas. We have less directives. Some of them are, and they are all related only to energy area. So so-called second and third energy package, like in EU, they are also part of our acquis or our legal framework. In the same in electricity. Then competition rules from EU should be also respected in energy community contracting parties. Antitrust and state aid rules from EU should be respected in these contracting parties, and so on and so on. So, and the way how to do it is that our Ministerial Council adopts directives and regulations which are not exactly copy-pasted from EU, a little bit adapted, but very, very similar. And there is the main difference between EU directives and EU regulations and our directives and our regulations is the timeline of implementation. In EU, this is of course designed originally, but then when it is transposed to energy community contracting parties, it has some delay. For example, third energy package had to be respected in EU countries in 2011, in our contracting parties with the 1st of January 2015, so this year. And not all of them have transposed it yet. But many of them are, or majority of them are on a very good way. There are some, if I just summarize most problematic open issues in energy area in our contracting parties is this, let's say, delay in implementation of third energy package, then regulated electricity and gas prices, which are in some countries, not in all, far below production prices, or import prices of gas, what of course creates quite huge debts, which somebody has to pay. And this somebody are of course, that or another way, taxpayers. Non-existence of definition of vulnerable customers. This is problem also in some EU member states, because these too low prices, regulated prices, are somehow, they are subsidized, and they are not subsidized and oriented towards people who would be really, who would really need them, but also to some people who have, let's say, political influence, groups, not individuals. Definition of socially vulnerable customers and of course subsidies oriented only towards them is a very important political issue, which is not solved in many of our contracting parties. Transparency of regional electricity and gas markets is still very weak, far behind developments in EU. Our contracting parties, for example, do not have power exchanges yet, electricity power exchanges yet. Serbia is establishing one now. The others do not have it yet. Ukraine has relatively functioning gas market, but not electricity market at all. Not to talk about many other contracting parties which do not have functioning market yet at all. But things are changing quite fast, I have to say. Large combustion plants directive is quite problematic. It's part of our acquis, but it envisages many investments into old, outdated thermal power, coal power plants, which are, of course, what is quite challenging for many of our contracting parties because it is just too expensive. If you can continue further on. There is only an overview. I will not going to present or to read. We started infringement procedures against our contracting parties because they do not transpose properly all the obligations. There are only cases. Who will be interested can read this later. Albania, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Kosovo, Macedonia, Serbia, and I didn't show Ukraine and Moldova. Montenegro is the only country towards which we didn't open any infringement procedure. We opened one, but we already closed it. So just to present what Energy Community is doing next to this transposition of EU legal framework, we are somehow associating electricity distribution system operators. We are trying to, where we are quite advanced. EU doesn't have such an association yet, but they will copy us very soon, I believe. Then electricity balancing cooperation doesn't function in EU as well. Here we are more advanced because especially ex-Yugoslavia had a perfectly functioning balancing market, electricity balancing market, which is now somehow reinvented in EU. We are associating electricity market operators. We have security of supply gas working group like EU has it after this crisis, Russian-Ukrainian crisis in 2009. Security of supply electricity working group, energy efficiency coordination group, and so on and so on. I will not read all of this, please go on. We have also many of other activities. Last year we started to draft also not only to commend legislation of our contracting parties, but we started to draft it. And now we are even participating in works of parliaments of our contracting parties, promoting this legislation which was drafted by us, because many of them do not have sufficient administrative capacities to do it and not enough expertise. So, for example, in last months we drafted new gas market law for Ukraine, new electricity market law for Ukraine, for Moldova, for Montenegro, for Albania, for Kosovo, for Bosnia, not for Serbia. Serbia did it by itself, and we only commented it. One of activities on which we are very proud is Mediation Center. We established it as a hobby for just, I would say, for fun, because there is Energy Charter, perhaps you have heard about it. It's a legal framework which envisages arbitrations in front of arbitrage in Stockholm, Paris, London, and so on, Washington. But this is very, very costly, and it lasts many years. And many law companies are very happy to participate because this is the best business. And then we established a cost-free mediation center in Vienna and started to mediate in some conflicts between, for example, Czech multinational ČEZ, which was nationalized in Albania, and Republic of Albania. And we just invited both sides. They met 7-8 times. On the end, we drafted them an agreement which cost 100 million euro approximately, and the problem was solved. The only expense which we had were some sandwiches for these 7-8 meetings, and that's all. So both parties were extremely happy, because otherwise they would wait for 10 years and Albania would be hostage of this for 10 years. Nobody would invest in Albania, and next day when we solved this problem, Czech Republic allowed the starting of the accession process of Albania to EU. So sometimes not much is needed, to solve very, very, very big questions. Only a little bit of goodwill, few sandwiches, and some good, I would say, surrounding. Then we also successfully solved the problem between transmission system operator from Serbia and Kosovo. This was an open issue for 15 years. And then they also met in our premises, and we drafted an agreement among them. But we are in quite a good position, because on one side we can start infringement procedure, on the other side we offer mediation support, and then things function. But this is only, one of our activities, just to illustrate what we are doing up there in Vienna. So if you can go on, every year we publish implementation report, which is then basis for accession progress report of our contracting parties on their way towards EU. We 2 years ago, we started a procedure of adopting so-called list of projects of energy community interest, so infrastructure projects that are of regional interest. Like EU has its own list of projects of common interest, which is also co-financed by EU budget, we said, why shouldn't we have our own projects of common interest without having such a budget support, of course, but at least to recognize what is of regional importance. And we launched this process with a cost-benefit analysis. Everything was very scientific, but all the contracting parties agreed in advance that they will recognize the outcome as it is. And this was a magic formula, because if we would bring a list of projects, then this political trade would start, my is more important, the neighbors is less important, neighbors with one is less important. But since we did it on the basis of cost-benefit analysis, where nobody knew what will come out on the end as a priority list, everybody agreed, and then we got such list of projects of energy community interest, which is nowadays basis even for EU for co-financing so-called connectivity projects in the region. This is how we invented the scientific process of cost-benefit analysis, but I will not go into details if you go on. So this is the map of projects of energy community interest in electricity generation. If you go on, in electricity interconnections, and in gas infrastructure or gas interconnectors. We also organized a capacity allocation office, regional one, but I will not go into details because it will be too much for you now. If you go, please, on. And for the end, only about a little bit about the future. So these were our original contracting parties. If you go on, these are our nowadays contracting parties. And so the scope of the organization changed. And this is why we started a procedure or a process of upgrading the Energy Community Treaty, because it becomes not only a temporary organization as a waiting room for contracting parties to become EU member states, but a long-lasting permanent organization. And if you can go on, we are otherwise, I mean, we are happy to have these embellishments. European Council and Parliament are all the time talking about us as a success story, most successful policy framework of the European external energy policy and so on. But this is not enough. I mean, we need some novelties. And so we established high-level reflection group chaired by Professor Jerzy Buzek, a very respected European member of a parliament, who then produced a report with many different proposals. And these proposals will be this year on Ministerial Council in October in Tirana discussed as potential amendments to the treaty. And one of them, on which I'm proud to present it there, is proposal to establish an Energy Community Parliamentary Assembly as well. We have, for example, a solidarity clause in our treaty, like NATO has it. If one is endangered in energy supply, then all the others have to help. For example, this year, Ukraine wanted to trigger this clause, and this is why European Union so deeply involved itself into these trilateral negotiations with Russia and Ukraine. This was the result of the solidarity clause. So then I said, why shouldn't we have a parliamentary assembly as well, if NATO has it? And we will hopefully establish it already this year. And that's all for the beginning, and I will be happy, of course, to answer any potential question. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kopac. We understood that energy community is an interesting tool to improve the stabilization of the energy situation, especially in this region, so which in turn helps attract foreign investment. So I think that this is important, particularly important. Now I invite Mr. Julian Popov to have his introductory remarks. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Bo. And I'd like to thank first the NATO Parliamentary Assembly and the Serbian Parliament for hosting this excellent event. I will also speak about energy, and we'll start not from the region, but from Ukraine. Ukraine is teaching us a very interesting lesson. What happened in Ukraine over the last 20 years, Ukraine massively reduced its security resilience in two ways. One was through its highly inefficient energy use, and the other through its kind of dysfunctional energy markets. Ukraine is the second most energy inefficient country in the world, and reportedly it spends 7.5% of its GDP on energy subsidies. I mean, that could be seen as simply economic problem or problems with political kind of governance, but what actually happened that exposed Ukraine massively to a level which made the all the troubles and the annexation of Crimea much more likely and possible. So after the annexation of Crimea, there was the realization what incredible role energy could play in national and regional and territorial security. And then the then Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk came up with the idea for the energy union. So the energy union is addressing two major issues. One is the energy security, so the security of supply, so that we have energy and we don't have problems with blackouts, with cold winters, and industry starved for gas supply. And the other issue, of course, is addressing and increasing the national and regional security resilience. So people who are familiar with the whole South Stream saga, in which Serbia was seriously involved, will know what massive impact, or potential impact, happily, infrastructure energy projects could have for the national security and for what some people increasingly call state capture, the ability of corporate or external national interests to exercise exactly this state capture, which is very high level of not even corruption, but something even more. So where is the Western Balkans in the whole thing? So the energy security, in my view, is wrongly seen as an EU game. So I haven't seen so far any statement that the energy union is locked inside the borders of the European Union. And there is a logic that's not to be the case. There is something else, however, in the energy union communication that was published by the European Commission on 25th of February. There is a special paragraph which is stating that Southeast Europe is a particularly vulnerable region, but at the same time it's a region with exceptionally rich clean energy and energy efficiency potential. There is no other part of Europe which has this high level of interest in the energy union communication and also the energy union policies. And there is a reason for that, and the reason is clearly stated inside the text. The region is vulnerable. It's internally vulnerable. It's quite kind of shaky and unstable. It has complicated history, and in the excellent presentation and the fantastic work that the energy community does and presented by Mr. Kopac, you see what happens with the countries inside the energy community. Some countries are inside the energy community, then they enter the European Union, that they get out of the energy community, they go into the European Union. So there is no sort of a common Southeast Europe arrangement on energy. So, and this is a problem because it opens, probably not to the extent of Ukraine, but it opens and increases the vulnerability of the region. And when we think how ambitious and aggressive sometimes are Russian interests in the region, Gazprom interests, but also we should not just see Putin trying to capture with his long or short arms a Balkan state, but also local companies that are benefiting from the monopoly position of gas import into the region play a very strong role. So all these vulnerabilities are recognized. And what is, I think, very important is to work towards regional cooperation arrangement that can bring together countries that are in Southeast Europe, not necessarily only countries that are inside the EU or just countries that are the Western Balkans, but to have a common view. And in that sense, I would say that there are three things that are at least needed to be done, and I very much hope that you will help with that. The first thing is that Turkey and the Western Balkans should be fully integrated into the process of the energy union. There's no reason why they should not be. And nobody is saying that they should not be, but just the fatigue and the inertia suggests that, well, this is EU stuff, but it's not. The second thing is that there is needed for us to have a regional infrastructure, energy infrastructure concept. The reality is that the cables don't stop at the border of the European Union. Bulgaria has a very active electricity trade with Turkey. When we talk about gas pipelines, they're going in and out of the European Union, and nobody is asking questions whether they're coming in the European Union or out, as long as they comply with the general rules of the third energy package. And the third thing is that there is a need for true regional markets. And these are areas where Southeast Europe is behind other parts of Europe. The Energy Union very clearly recognizes that the energy cooperation and the energy integration is happening on a regional basis, not on a European basis. The old concept, 5 years ago, was that we will build one beautiful integrated European market. But the reality is not like that. The reality is that, there is North Sea process, there is a pentalateral process, there are various regional processes, and everywhere there are regional power exchanges appearing, gas hubs and so on. Everywhere except in Southeast Europe. And this is absolutely essential for the regional security, not just energy security, but also national security and territorial security, that these processes are seriously accelerated. And one last thing I would like to say is, when we talk about energy security, we automatically assume that this is about gas. Well, it's not about gas. It's about, for instance, energy efficiency. If Ukraine was energy efficient, it would not need to import a single cubic meter of gas from Russia or from anywhere. Ukraine has sufficient energy resources to satisfy its economy. Just the numbers show it. This region is not a gas user. Turkey uses quite a lot of gas. Romania uses quite a lot of gas, but Romania is extracting this gas and has the plan by 2020 to become a net exporter of gas. But Bulgaria, Serbia, Greece, they use 10-12% of the energy, primary energy use is gas. Macedonia, Kosovo, and other countries, gas is absolutely negligible. At the same time, the hydro potential, the hydro storage potential, which is absolutely essential for the growing renewable and intermittent energy, the biomass, solar, wind, every single renewable energy resource is absolutely abundant, not just abundant, but it's economically achievable because it's cheaper. In fact, solar and wind is cheaper than new lignite in this region. But I will not want to go into that debate because I'm sure that somebody will start opposing. But generally that is the issue, and we have to work for this integration, energy integration of the region, for the sake of the economic prosperity, but also for the sake of the regional security. Thank you.
Thank you, Union, for your very wide view and your very interesting suggestions. I think that there will be several questions. We have got already 6 of them. I will group in 3, and the first one is Mr. Edmund Witorot from Poland.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank you all the speakers for the excellent presentations. I have questions to all of you. The first is to Mr. Bachev. You said about the cooperation and the way from security to economy and so, but you also mentioned that the expectation from that point of view are not reached. My question is about the cooperation in education, research, NGOs, culture, youth, because I think it's very important for the future of the region. I know as it was important in our region, for example, about the history of different countries. And do you have some kind of debate about the common history and so on? The second question is to Mr. Jonas Kopacz. That's important, the energy union, the security, but there was also in the program proposed by Donald Tusk, there was also some possibility to have a common negotiation, group negotiation vis-à-vis the gas and oil suppliers. Do you also think that it is possible? And the question to Mr. Popov is, you said that's climate change, economy and climate, because to take care of climate, it is very costly. You said that we should cooperate in some regions, but also important is the global size, the global scale, because if it is a cost, then the different regions might be in a different situation from the point of view of expenditures, which should be spent to climate change. Thank you.
Thank you. Lord Hamilton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to ask Mr. Popov, please, about the Trans-Adriatic pipeline, which has the great advantage that it bypasses Russia, and it comes, I think, from Kazakhstan or Azerbaijan, and it's due to come into Italy, and there were problems with it being brought into Italy, but I gather those problems are now being overcome. With the cancellation of South Stream, I just want to know what the impact of the Trans-Adriatic pipeline will be, bringing this gas into Europe, where presumably it can be distributed all over Europe, both in and outside the EU.
Thank you. Mr. Dragan Šormas from Serbia.
Hvala.
Thank you. I agree with what Mr. Popov has said. Serbia participates with 10 to 12% in the use of gas, usage of gas at this very moment, but we have to work on improving projects of energy efficiency. Last year, you've seen last year what kind of water flows we have. We had major floods last year. You know what the situation with the coal is. I should mention that Brussels agreement refers to the energy sector agreements as well. We have this problem with Trepča, which is a coal mine in Kosovo and Metohija. You know that it was constructed by Serbia, and stocks of coal are still in Kosovo, which could be very useful for the whole region, and it should be used in an efficient manner in accordance with the market needs, and the owner should use this properly. unfortunately, we still have problems, and hopefully we will manage to solve this problem through Brussels agreements. In February 2008, I was in Baku. I think it was February. It was the Rose-Roth seminar, and directorate, if I recall correctly, was BP director for Central Asia. It seems to me that he was from Central Asia, and he told me that Nabucco is only a word, only a term. We heard from a man who is an expert from a company, who is a very strong company on a global scale, and he explained why. And then he explained why Gazprom Neft is such a strong company, why it's a better company, because it's a privately owned company. A year before that, Serbia signed an energy agreement with Russia, and it turns out that this agreement is a failed agreement. In my opinion, we have sold our national industry for cheap, for nothing, for peanuts, and we received the promise that South Stream would happen, and now we see that South Stream failed as a project. So I'm wondering whether European Union or all of us who are sitting here have expertise or knowledge to create a strong and sustainable energy market, such as one that exists in Germany, in France. Is it possible to organize such a market here in Western Balkans? Is it possible that those who are closest to us, for example, in my opinion, it's Iran, it's Central Asia, Kazakhstan, and so on. Is there a possibility for to construct a strong pipeline, gas line, that will go through this part of the world and in that way make us more competitive market? You know that United States are constructing something similar, but in the other part of the world. I'm just wondering, is it possible to have something like that here?
Okay. Mr. Becher.
Let me just now look at the question of cooperation in areas of education, research, youth. There's been quite a bit of focus there as well. If you remember the Stability Pact first dimension, the first basket was about that. In my judgment, the results are very patchy. You can look at success stories, you can look at unfulfilled expectations. History teaching, segregated, Bosnia is a good example. We've heard it time and again. But then again, you have several initiatives that have made some progress. The Center for Regional Reconciliation in Thessaloniki has produced common textbooks by leading historians. Now, how much that material which is out there in this product of common efforts has changed the way we look at the past is an open question. But on this side of the ledger, you also have to factor in initiatives or processes that are bottom-up. They're not driven by the institutions, but a product of interconnectivity. Now in the former Yugoslav territories, popular culture is getting united. Reality shows, musical bands and so on and so forth. And I think the countries are coming together at this grassroots level. So that's the success story. And overall, again, it's a picture of half empty, half full. Some have been achieved, but we are long from having a much more cohesive view of the past and the conflicts of the 90s especially. If I can say a few words about gas as well. Now, the Trans-Adriatic pipeline, of course, it looks great on paper, but at the end of the day, 10 BCM is a drop in the ocean. It's not huge volumes. Only thing that might change the regional balance is if Shah Deniz is scaled up, and then you have additional volumes flowing that direction. But again, I think Julian made a very valid point. The region is not a big consumer of gas, which is often forgotten. Now, I think Azerbaijan is likely to be a big player. It's involved more and more in the region, not only that Haider Aliyev Square is not far from here, but also they have invested in Montenegro. Bulgaria and Azerbaijan have contracted 1 BCM a year. We don't need to have the infrastructure, but the contract is out there. Now Ilham Aliyev visited Sofia and promised that there will be more cooperation. Of course, Azerbaijan is very heavily invested into Turkey with 1 refinery. So that's another external player involved in Southeast Europe worth pointing out. And another area of gas, of course, is the potential of LNG. Now, it's a pipe dream because LNG is very expensive. But in the future, if prices on the global market go down, and there is a clear prospect that will make LNG economical in this area. Of course, then you have to ask if big companies and countries are ready to invest into LNG infrastructure, which is quite expensive. But that's an open issue.
Thank you. Mr. Kopac.
Thanks. First about energy union, asked by a Polish, distinguished Polish representative. Idea about, European Union started with with the idea of energy union. So back in 50s. So this was the first idea was to establish community of steel and coal, and coal at that time was energy. There was no nuclear energy. There was nothing else substantial, and so everything started with the energy. And I believe everything will end with the energy as well in EU. In the meantime, this community of steel and coal developed into finally on European Union. Very many things have been integrated. Now EU functions as a state. We have even banking union. We have many other unions inside European Union. But in energy area, not all necessary things have been done. And what is important, there are two things. EU is still functioning with competencies of states in energy policy, and this causes 2 problems. One problem is that, for example, with Gazprom as a big seller, everybody negotiates by himself, and of course all these contracts are very different, and Gazprom is playing its own game with every single interlocutor. And second one is that energy mixes are nationally defined, and if one country like Germany, for example, decides on Energiewende, this causes suddenly tremendous problems to all surrounding of Germany, and they didn't ask anybody about it because it's their sovereignty. So there were discussions inside EU how to make these 2 things, so energy mix and negotiations with big suppliers like Gazprom, a little bit more unified. And the first idea was launched by Jacques Delors and Jerzy Buzek, I think in 2010, and this idea was called European Energy Community. But then later, last year in April, Mr. Donald Tusk renamed it into Energy Union, and since Mr. Tusk became President of EU Council, Commission couldn't neglect this fact, and they introduced a position of Vice President for Energy Union. And so the process of a definition what this Energy Union is started, and now it is somehow finished with this paper on Energy Union, which was discussed a month ago and approved. And in this paper I can say, but this idea of common gas aggregator on the level of EU was not supported by very many EU member states. It was heavily criticized that it would interfere competition rules, and in this paper on Energy Union somehow was, not deleted the idea, but it's very weak one. And the only thing that is possible is discussion about potential voluntarily aggregation of different players. Now we in energy community, just let's say to see if it functions, started such a process of voluntarily collecting gas demand function, and we will see if it will function there. It will function in EU as well, I believe, but we will see what will come out of this process. But it was not very successful, I have to say, and it's pity, because EU is really strong if it is if it functions together, and that's it. But the main thing related to gas, I think, or the main trend related to gas in Europe is energy efficiency. EU is a consumer which every single year now for many years decreases gas consumption because of energy efficiency measures. And this really functions. For example, from last year till in last 1 year, the consumption was decreased by approximately 10% in EU. That's a lot. And with further trend of decreasing gas consumption, also vulnerability of EU and dependence on Russia or whomever is smaller and smaller. It will remain, but it is smaller. And EU started with very many actions that solved many problems with these reverse gas flows, with building of gas terminals like Świnoujście in Poland, for example, and so on and so on. And it is true that now all the gas suppliers, including Gazprom, had to recognize this new fact. So there is no, I mean, only diversity and only energy efficiency is the proper answer. And diversity, there was a Serbian representative asking if there will be a new huge pipe. There will be no new huge pipe, and I think it wouldn't be good to have a new huge pipe from anywhere, because then you are too dependent on one source. This dependency, for example, you can see all the political impetus that this brings. South Stream has never been a project of security of gas supply, never. It was always a geopolitical project, and it has never been economic, and this is why it's bankrupted somehow. And I think it's good, because otherwise EU consumers would pay it. Now, for example, Russia is discussing with Turkey to build a Turkish stream. But at the same time, Turkey doesn't want to be too dependent on Russian gas as well. You have to know that, for example, natural gas from Russia is currently sold in Turkey for higher prices than LNG, which comes from Qatar or from anywhere. So I don't know if they will agree on this Turkish stream or not. But things in gas market are changing, and there is this Trans-Adriatic pipeline, as Lord Hamilton of Epsom asked, of course will be built. It's already, they started the construction. It will bring 10 billion cubic meters towards southern Italy, but 10 billion cubic meters is not much. You know, it's almost a peanut to EU consumption. You have to know that, for example, Netherlands, as one of big producers, from last year till this year decreased gas extraction for 10 billion cubic meters in 1 year, because they have some geological problems and some earthquakes in the area of Groningen. So the only proper answer, perhaps I'm too long already in this, is decreasing gas consumption and diversity of supply. But there is no one magic formula, that's true.
Thank you.
Thank you. Many questions. I'll try to be brief. First on the Polish question about the, if I may, I would like to say something about this common purchasing of gas. That was the initial drive, but this is very strongly opposed, as Mr. Kopacz said. But there are two answers to that can completely replace the idea. One is market. I mean, at the moment there is a market, the price goes down. Collective purchasing, nobody knows whether that will do. But the other is transparency. In the energy community, in the energy union communication, there is a special emphasis on transparency. Poland was one of the countries that were fighting hard for transparency. UK was another, Bulgaria was another, because it suffered for that. Transparency is absolutely vital for preventing sort of bogus, massive, multi-billion projects coming into the European Union without clarity what all that is. On climate policies are costly. Well, they used to be. They're not anymore. They're cheap. But there is a regional difference. So, for instance, in Poland, you might have higher costs for reducing emissions. In Albania, it will be much cheaper to use renewable energy than non-renewable energy, because there is renewable energy, and there are two countries in Europe with 100% renewable electricity. One is Norway, the other is Albania. If we look into new installations, so the prospective levelized cost of electricity for the new Kosovo new Kosovo power plant is 80 euros per megawatt hour. That's the assessment of Polish experts. This is higher than what wind or solar can produce in this region. So that's why I said that lignite is becoming more expensive than solar and wind, and not to talk about hydro, which is a huge, massive story here, and hugely relevant also. On Lord Hamilton, Mr. Kopacz answered very clearly on that. Yes, TAP is not going to make a big difference, but it's a very strong sort of symbolic also message, and we can expect also other sources through Turkey, but not only through Turkey, to come into Europe. The problem with gas is there is too much, not too little. I mean, we are facing in the future oversupply, not shortage of supply, and this is why Putin would be prepared to come with the battleships with pipes rather than with something else into Europe, to sort of carve a share, physically carve a share from the market, because this market is shrinking, and we're surrounded by a lot of gas, and we are sitting and dreaming about how much shale gas there is in United States, but around the corner in Algeria has more shale gas than United States. On the Mr. Sarmas, your question about we have to increase the gas. The thing is, gas is not competitive in many areas. So, for instance, the main use of gas is heating. In this region, gas is not competitive for heating. It's 2 times more expensive than biomass, which is the preferred heating fuel in the region. And the problem is that biomass is used in a very inefficient and environmentally not compliant or not appropriate way. If you use biomass, if you go to Vienna, I'm not sure whether there is somebody from Vienna here, but if you go to Vienna to the central heating power station, which is almost in the center of Vienna, one of the 3, it burns wood, and it's clean, so, and it's cheaper than gas. And in this part of the world, definitely it's not. So gas has quite a serious problem about that. And also one of your other questions about can European Union create energy market? It's absolutely vital to create energy market here, both for gas and for electricity. But that has to be regional. One thing that we should not allow is this Russian idea of we will build a gas hub on the Turkish-Greek border. Who are you that you will come and build a gas hub anywhere? And also you don't build gas hubs. Gas hubs are a function of market environment. Unless there are a lot of supplies from different ways, unless Turkey, but even more, Bulgaria and Greece fully liberalize their markets, gas hub, you can't create gas hub. Everybody wants to be a gas hub. The Bulgarian government loves the idea to be a gas hub, but that's not going to happen. But even more importantly, I think it's the regional electricity market. And here I would also appeal to the Serbian government when you have the ambition to create a regional electricity exchange, power exchange, and to connect to this, to invite, I think, Montenegro and Macedonia probably to join. You should also invite EU countries. When I asked DG Enlargement, they're supporting this idea, will Bulgaria and Romania be also invited there? They said, oh, no, it's just for the Western Balkans. Why on earth it should be for the Western Balkans? If Serbia is further ahead in developing a proper power market, they should be ambitious to connect EU countries as well into it. And there is absolutely no point to think, well, this will be in Serbia, why it's not in Skopje, why it's not in Sofia. The interest of the consumer is the low power price and the low gas price. Whether the power exchange is in Belgrade or is in Manchester, it's absolutely irrelevant.
Thank you. We have 7 more questions, which means that the topic is very interesting for everybody, but we have something less than 20 minutes left, so I have to ask you to be very short in the question as well as in the answer, please. Ms. Filipovski, please.
Zahvaljujem. Ja imam 2 kratka.
I have 2 short questions for Mr. Kopacz and for Mr. Popov. For you, Mr. Kopacz, how do you see energy community coordinating energy efficiency in its contracting parties? And the second question refers to Mr. Popov. You said that for the energy cooperation it's very important to take into account 3 factors: the networking between the countries in the region, infrastructure, and the market. And then you mentioned for the markets that concerning the Southeastern Europe market, you mentioned that it's not well developed. How do you think this market could become more developed, and how can it become more competitive? Thank you. My question is, how does energy community coordinate energy efficiency between its contracting parties?
I would like to be brief, but to Mr. Popper, we have to make some remarks on his report. I would like to say first, shortly, briefly, energy efficiency in Ukraine. I can't say that it's a very low energy efficiency, and it's a weak point, bottleneck of Ukrainian energy, and the corruption there is pervasive. It's awful. It's worse than energy efficiency, but Mr. Popov very well knows that we have quite a complex situation, because always energy business up to 2014 was business run by politicians. It was not only business, it was the business of the presidents. President of Russian Federation and presidents of Ukraine that used this business to get dividends. Moreover, I would like to say simply that the price of energy sources in Ukraine was closely linked, directly linked to the politics. We had the least prices of gas in Ukraine, and since 2014 we started to pay the highest European gas price. With that, we didn't have When we started to buy gas on the border with Russia, we paid more than $500 for 1,000 cubic meters of gas. However, energy efficiency-wise, we are working with that, and we consumed gas about 40 billion cubic meters. Before this year, it was only 20 billion cubic meters from Russia. Our energy ministry stated that as of April, we can refrain from buying Russian gas. And today, we hear that Russia is ready to sell more or give more concessions, lower prices in gas. As for the gas pipeline, I would like to say that gas pipelines in Russia, South Stream, North Stream, it's not business. It's political, deeply political projects. It's very serious. First of all, to bypass Ukraine and not to give the Ukraine to make money on the transit of gas, the first, and secondly, to have a very serious leverage of pressure on the consumers of that gas that will be on the receiving end of this pipeline. And so this involvement of political management, we know that there are politicians who are on the payroll of Gazprom. All the questions of Gazprom in Europe. So I would like to ask something, Mr. Popov. Maybe I misunderstood the translation. Maybe you will tell me what is the interdependency of a low energy efficiency of Ukraine and the annexation of Crimea, because as I heard in translation, this is how it influenced the annexation of Crimea, low energy efficiency in Ukraine. And something more I would like to say, just briefly. Ukraine is not unreliable transit gas. Even during the wartime, there were no disruptions of gas transportation. All the contracts were honored for the Western Europe related to gas supplies. Thank you.
Mr. Laboyun for Turkey. Again, I have to ask you to be very short because we have no time for a debate, unfortunately.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I would like to thank all the speakers for their presentations. And Turkey, in terms of energy, Turkey is not the source country, but Turkey is a transition country, especially from Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Turkey is supplying some gas to Europe. But in our country, more than 48, almost 50% of the electricity is produced by gas power plant. So we are mainly dependent on the Russian gas, 60%. So Russia is a main player in the region. We may like it or not, but we cannot, because of the long-term contract, we are dependent on the Russian gas. And of course we have to diversify our energy, but the fragile situation in the Western Balkans, we have to solve it. As Mr. Popov said, I mean, this region is rich in terms of the clean energy, electricity, I mean, the sun, wind, and especially water. I mean, we have to utilize. So my question is related to the common energy policy of the European Union. European Union has a common agricultural policy. So common energy, maybe we may need a common infrastructure in terms of pipeline, common infrastructure in terms of interconnections, a common infrastructure in terms of deposition of the gas for the emergency use. Thank you very much.
Thank you. One more question for Mr. Pogosyan from Armenia, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have two questions, very short. One to Mr. Bechev. You mentioned about regional cooperation or energy cooperation is the bottom line in the story of regional cooperation. The sentence has been around this. In that regard, as these 2 days here, we're walking on the street and seeing a lot of Russian investment here and as I understand it's trying to penetrate by business. Is Russia has any role in the promotion of regional cooperation, or vice versa, it's trying to kind of a divide and then control? And my second question to Mr. Popov. Actually, your position about lessons from Ukraine for me hurt like we need to understand that dependence from one country is always a negative element. And on that regard, as you also mentioned that TANAP is a much more symbolic way. Actually, in Baku last summer, we also heard that it can provide maybe 1.2% of the all European needs, which is not really a strong alternative. But now is Russia moving to Turkey again out of the south kind of a stream, and also in Balkans has a lot of investment there. Isn't it repetition of the mistakes of Ukrainian lessons that we're trying to build up another dependency here? And later on, what the difference? Is it the Russian dependence for Ukraine or to the Russian dependence for the Western Balkans? Would it ever contribute to energy union and energy independence? Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Koppel, please.
How we Ms. Filipowski asked how we coordinate energy policy. First, okay, we have several groups. But I mean the main instrument to coordinate is to monitor implementation of the directives. So directives are guidelines, and everything is about directives and their implementation in the practice. So we have energy efficiency coordination group, we have I already mentioned earlier gas security working group, and other different groups, and we all the time bring together all regional players and they coordinate things among themselves, and we of course help them. So but this coordination really functions inside. So this is why I think that such a framework as energy communities is a really functioning one. So on one side you have obligations, very concrete, and on the other side you have somebody who is watching over if this is implemented. And it is regional, it's not only country, so one organization towards one country, but it is regional. So we have many ways of coordinating this, and this really functions. Then we are kind of an intermediator between European Commission and, for example, Serbia, because Serbia and Montenegro are most developed in accession process, and sometimes we help to settle some things also on the relation between Brussels and Belgrade. Vienna is in between. Okay, there was no other direct question to me, but perhaps I can only shortly help to answer colleagues. Energy efficiency in Ukraine. Ukraine is statistics is really good in Ukraine. It's 11 times less energy efficient than average in EU. And for example, Ukraine has 45 billions of cubic meters of gas consumption per year currently, and 20 billion cubic meters are produced domestically. So if Ukraine would be the same efficient as Poland, not as average of EU, there would be no gas import, because 20 billion cubic meters of domestic production is enough. If there would be energy efficiency sufficient or the same as in average in EU, Ukraine would be gas exporter and reliable one. It's really true what Mr. Chumak said. Ukraine, for example, in 2009, this gas transit of Russian gas towards EU was really shaky. But now, I mean, in last year, Ukraine put everything on internet. You can every minute see which are the flows on the Russian-Ukrainian border. Everything is transparent. Everything is in English. Really excellent, much better than in many EU member states, I have to say. So Ukraine in this last year really became a reliable partner when talking about gas business. And perhaps only a short answer on this suggestion of Mr. Alaboyun to have a common infrastructure policy. There is already one. EU established projects of common interest, so these are list of infrastructure projects and the energy community projects of energy community interest. And these two lists are interlinked. So there is already a common infrastructure policy. It's a new process, really. But Turkey, of course, is invited to join it as soon as possible as well.
Thank you, Mr. Popov.
Thank you. On the underdeveloped market, what we need is political will. And things here are quite politicized, and that's why, basically, very specifically, get all the energy ministers together, EU and non-EU, with the political will to support the rapid development of gas hub or gas market somewhere, but mainly electricity market. That's the key. We're electricity countries, we're not gas countries. And that will, otherwise in terms of electricity infrastructure, we're quite well connected. I mean, if we compare us with the comical case between Spain and France, for instance, I mean, Spain is an energy island. We are absolutely 10 times better connected here on average, probably, compared to some other parts of EU. So there is a very good ground for development. Mr. Chumak, well, Mr. Kopacz answered most of this question. As I very much agree on the issue of corruption. It's a bit sort of, yes, probably corruption was leading the inefficiency and making use of inefficiency and massive waste of energy. So whether we'll call that inefficiency or corruption is a bit of a linguistic question, but actually the director of Naftogaz made this point that the market efficiency and the energy efficiency is a matter of national security in the country. So how exactly they are linked, it's probably a longer and a little bit speculative conversation. I'd be very happy. We don't have time, I think, for that, but we'd be very happy to discuss that. One thing which I would like to add about Ukraine, to all the good things that have been said, Ukraine has also something else that can sell to Europe. It's gas storage. I mean, you can't have gas market without gas storage, and Ukraine has huge gas storage, and it's a commodity that could be sold. So this is one other reason why South Stream was a bit of a pipe dream, or just a dream. And on the issue of the common energy policy, I fully agree with what Mr. Kopacz said. I would add just something else. I think we have to disconnect the Turkey accession project and the energy chapter, all the issues and blocking of all these things, from the actual development of the energy infrastructure and energy markets. Energy markets and energy infrastructure could be developed completely independently from all this incredibly frustrating process for Turkey, and we have to be pragmatic and focus on that and just bypass and overtake the rest. And the final question, whether we create another dependency from Russia. Well, the thing is that if you have dependency from two countries, you don't have a dependency anymore. Well, we have sort of dependency, but if you have dependency of multiple sources, you remove the dependency issue. We don't want, we're not dreaming of a world in which we will not buy gas from Russia, but we have to create a market firewall between EU and Russia and have a market relations on the basis of multiple suppliers. Thank you.
Can Mr. Popov just spell out the links between energy efficiency in the Ukraine and the annexation of Crimea?
Sorry?
The question from my colleague in the Ukraine was the links between energy efficiency in the Ukraine and the annexation of Crimea.
Yeah, I said it's that was one, the direct, the answer to that is that the energy inefficiency, the massive waste of energy, and the corruption, the huge corruption that Mr. Chumek was explaining, that this was not Ukrainian, this was a presidential kind of a business, is a package that massively reduces the security resilience of the country. So if you have the whole country captured by gas importers or meat exporters or whatever, you don't have a country that you can defend anymore.
Thank you. We have 4 more questions.
Yeah.
Short time, but I have to ask you patience to go on 10 minutes more. Mr. Pettersson from Sweden.
Thank you. I will try to be time efficient. I will like to start with a personal observation after 2 days in Serbia, which support Mr. Popov and Mr. Kupac. I'm observed that you're heating your houses to a very high temperature. So I think this is an unscientific observation, but I think it supports that there is a lot to gain from energy efficiency.
In the hotel.
And the other more serious point, if the Western Balkan has the opportunity to build out hydroelectric, that would be very important to Europe, because we very often in the debate confuse energy and power. And with the German Energiewende, we will need balancing hydroelectric power. So if the Western Balkan could be a source of hydroelectric power, that could both be a source of income and a source of wealth, and be doing a good service to the European Union. Thank you.
Mr. Scilipoti, please.
Sì, grazie. Thank you. My question, well, I have a series of questions, but I will just ask the most important one. We talked about the gas pipeline, and recently we were told that it was one of the famous 12 energy corridors. We were told that it was a key infrastructure project, that the energy action could not be replaced by anything else. Now we know that it supplies 7 million families with various cubic meters, and some said we could even get up to 20 billion cubic meters and 14 million families. But there is something that we do not understand, and we're trying to understand what is going on. We were told that this could last for 20 years at the most, and everyone would have to make sacrifices, and yet the speaker said that this is a drop in the ocean. Plus, he also mentioned photovoltaic energy and what is happening in Greece and in Macedonia. So my question is it worth to invest so much and to make so many sacrifices for something that will last 20 years at the most? And if from the point of view of photovoltaic cells this is true, couldn't we find solutions that might be slightly different from the ones we have found now? And I would like to add something else. We cannot talk about biomass or clean energy or clean coal. There is no clean coal. Coal is coal, and the noxious effects have been proved over the years. Many scientists in the world say that there is no such thing as a clean coal. Thank you.
Garrido, please.
Thank you, Chairman. I like to ask to the panelists on the current dropping in oil prices in the world. Two questions. First, why this phenomenon? Second, what's the impact in Western Balkans? Thank you.
Last question to Mr. Pajasiti from Kosovo.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just wanted to very shortly to inform about what is happening in Kosovo about energy. There is a huge reserve of lignite in Kosovo, and actually we are using a very old technology for producing the energy. This year we are planning to build a new power plant, and there is a very good advantage for us in the others. We are planning not to be only consumer of the energy, but also to produce energy for a region. But actually what I wanted to ask is, there is a disagreement with some civil society organization, especially with an environmental organization, and the question is in between energy needs and environment vis-a-vis EU policies, how to deal with and how to proceed with, and very shortly also to comment and to answer to Mr. Sormas. He mentioned Trepča. That is a big company, but Trepča actually is not have any impact on energy field. And he also mentioned the ownership of Trepča. Actually, Trepča is a public, not private company, it's public enterprise, and the real and legal owner of Trepča is Pristina. It means Kosovar institutions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Before giving the floor to our speakers for the last answers, I would like to say that when we were in Baku for the Rose-Roth seminar last year, we understood that the Southern Corridor program is now ready for supplying 10 billion cubic meters from Azerbaijan, but it is sized up to 120 billion cubic meters, because it should have, the corridor should have the possibility to take gas also from Iran and maybe also from Iraq in the future. So that's just what we understood at that time.
Yeah, of course, the Southern Corridor has huge potential, but I mean, there are so many issues to do with politics, delimitation, Azerbaijan, Turkmenistan. I mean, it's far from over. And also Iran, I mean, it is supplying Turkey these days, but it's far from being a reliant supplier. If you look at the commercial disputes Turkey and Iran have had over the years. And Iranian gas is more expensive than Russian gas right now. So a huge question mark. Now, a question about Russia. Is it helping regional cooperation or dividing the region? I think it is interested in regional cooperation. But the catch there, it is interested in regional cooperation on its own terms, the way it does it, which is very different from the way EU encourages regional cooperation. To give you a very clear example, now South Stream. The Russian argument was that the countries involved in South Stream should be treated as first and foremost as sovereign entities. So EU law takes second place to the intergovernmental agreements concluded with the likes of Bulgaria, Serbia, Croatia, and Hungary. So yeah, we cooperate, we sit at the same table, but it's a hub-and-spoke of bilateral relationship, and EU is not as important as our sovereign way of dealing with you, which goes on to show that Russia in the region is exploiting gaps in the Western policy. It's exploitative power. A clear example is furnished by Serbia. The recognition of Kosovo 2008 opened the door for Russian influence here. Serbia saltness, and of course there are grievances about the price, about the conditions, But Russia was absent for about 8 years, from 2001 to 2008, but it identified a way to insert itself into Southeast Europe. So it's, yeah, I mean, it's bringing the region together, but in a very Russian way, which is distinctive. Now with the termination of South Stream, Russia tried to use divide and conquer, turning to Turkey. Say, okay, there is no South Stream, there will be Turkish Stream. But even with Turkish Stream, you have to take it with a pinch of salt. It's far from being a done deal. Turkey has a long list of demands to Russia. The first demand was to live up or to fulfill the contractual obligations. Volumes coming to Turkey were reduced because Gazprom was reducing volumes to a whole bunch of suppliers because of the reverse flow. But that's the least difficult bet. The other one, which is really important, is discount. Turkey wants 16%, Russia offered 15% was Turkish demand. Now Russia has agreed on 10.25, but it's far from over. And the whole technical formula, who pays for what is the feasibility of the project, what will be the volume supplied via Turkish Stream, is anything but certain. So Turkey feels it's a very strong position. It will benefit from Russia being open now, and probably Russia needs more Turkey than Turkey needs Russia at this point with Turkish Stream. So divide and conquer, it's not as easy as it seemed. Is South Stream political? Yes, it is, but there is an economic twist to it as well. We have to understand that it's not only the commercial interest of the suppliers, of the consumers that is at stake, but also so you can look at South Stream as a big scheme to redistribute rents within Russia itself. It was important who is supplying the pipes, which are the companies around Gazprom which are involved in this consortium, and so on and so forth. And you can see lots of people close to Putin and the Kremlin involved in the scheme. And there is this political economy angle from the Russian side. Now finally, if I may, oil prices. There are a long list of explanations. Overinvestment in the previous period when prices were high, now very feeble demand, especially in emerging economies like China, and there is a lot of slack in the oil business. How it impacts the region? I don't think that there's been a huge downturn of oil prices at the retail market, partly because in some countries you have monopoly on the refinery side in downstream business. Serbia is a good example, also Bulgaria. Lukoil is practically a monopoly player. It has benefited Turkey, which is a huge importer of oil, because it runs huge current account deficit. Now that has improved because of low oil.
Deficit.
Final sentence. This is one area where actually Turkey and Russia are diverging, because Turkey wants to reduce its import bill. Russia wants to sell more energy to countries downstream. So thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Kopacz?
There were several more or less comments, less questions, and of course I agree with most of them. But I would just like to stress once again how important processes are, how important process is energy efficiency. Subsidies for renewables energy are worth on the long run. I think it will be profitable and good. But the cheapest is energy that you don't use at all. And here I think Europe can somehow show to the whole world an expertise which is a fascinating one, with energy efficiency in buildings, for example. I believe, no, I've not, but statistics shows that EU is most efficient on the world, and there is a lot that can be done. And so only decreased energy consumption is the best guarantee for security of supply, for good cooperation, for stable relations with neighbors, and so on. When there is still, of course, a need, then diversification helps. And this is something what has been perhaps more taken into account in EU as a whole. I'm just chatting with colleague Mr. Popov over there, how the whole paper of Energy Union, which is now being approved, is very, very weak on international cooperation. EU is, I can say, in energy questions very introverted in last years, and without taking into account deeper cooperation with all the periphery or all the neighborhood, there will be no success even in EU. There is a big power game on the world. There is a fight of empires, I would say, and EU, despite not being an empire, has to somehow behave properly, and empires are always lost on the periphery, never in a center. And this is what has to be more respected in the future EU energy, international energy policy as well.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you for the remark on the hydro energy. Absolutely agree. This could be, like Ukraine is so valuable in terms of gas storage, this part can be incredibly valuable in terms of power storage, like Sweden and Norway, for instance, are in the northern part of Europe. The TAP, should you invest or not invest, I think these things should be very much driven also by economic reasons, because otherwise they turn into stranded assets and collapse like South Stream collapse. But TAP, I don't know where this 20 years thing is coming from. I think it has a major strategic reason for diversification of sources. And the clean coal, I didn't mention clean coal. I don't believe in clean coal. But clean biomass, this is a bit more complicated because it depends how biomass is developed and used. On oil price, for the region, I'm not aware of some specific in-depth study on the impact of low oil price. As a oil and gas importer, I would say it benefits, but this benefit is not dramatic. And then the question on Kosovo and the dilemma between environmental standards and use of lignite, it is a very difficult question, but again we have to look at it in regional context. Kosovo is probably the best power-connected country in Europe, I think, or one of the top three. With neighboring countries.
They don't have connection with Albania.
Well, they're building now with Albania. but compared with countries with, I don't know, 6-7%, but the thing is that these connections, they have to be upgraded, but there should be a regional market, and then in terms of, and when you put in that context everything, then you might see that building a new coal power plant according to the best available technology, which is EU requirement, gets you to levelized cost of electricity of 80 euro per megawatt hour, when in not very far in Austria on the power exchange the electricity is traded at 35 euro per megawatt hour. So I think that's the context in which that has to be discussed. And finally, just on the southern gas corridor and the hundreds and billion of cubic meters, yes, it has a big potential. But one thing I'd like to say about the southern gas corridor, the southern gas corridor should be renamed into Southern Energy Corridor, because there is a very compelling case that there might be Southern Gas Corridor, but there is even more of a reason to have a Southern Electricity Corridor. So if we want to go with the terminology of corridors, it should be Energy Corridor, not a Gas Corridor.
Thank you. Thank you to the speakers for their important contribution. Thank you to everybody for questions and for your patience. And now I have to ask you just no more than 10 minutes break, because we have run out of time. Thank you. So good morning. Let's start with the second panel. Welcome back, dear colleagues. My name is Júlio Miranda Calha. I'm from Portugal, and I am the General Rapporteur of Defense and the Security Committee of NATO Parliamentary Assembly. The fourth session, this session of our seminar, is dedicated to a very acute international problem, namely the threat posed by foreign fighters. This problem has also affected the Western Balkans region, but this dimension is not very well known across the Euro-Atlantic community. Therefore, we are delighted to have with us today a very impressive and competent panel of experts from whom we will discuss the Balkans' perspective on the foreign fighter problem. Since we do not have much time, because we know always that this is a lot of time to discuss these issues, and because you have all the biographies in front of you, I would like to give the floor to our first panelist, Alexander Georgievich, Director of Serbia's Security Information Agency. Mr. Georgievich, it's here. You have the floor, and thank you for coming.
Thank you all. I will try to present an analysis of common threats in the context of the foreign fighters in the Middle East and Northern Africa. The participation of foreign fighters within the terroristic structures, first and foremost, when the Islamic State was organized in Syria and Iraq, on the internal and a global plan, has estimated as one of the highest or the most severe security risks, and it represents the logistical and foundation for this formation in the European Union. Recently executed terrorist act in Charlie Hebdo in Paris is an example then that these terrorist activities are using EU states for their terrorist acts. But since we cannot determine for a fact how many foreign fighters are in Syria and Iraq, they say that there is 16,000 foreign fighters and 3,000 of them are from the European states. And every time when the situation in the Middle East worsens, we get the increase of threats, risks, and of extremism in the territory of Europe. We have a significant number of returnees from Syria and Iraq who are a new threat to the EU member states, and one of the challenges for security that exists is caused by various humanitarian and other associations that work in different parts of the world and that have preached the teachings of true Islam, and have advocated the establishment of a universal state based on Sharia law. The organization they work through, legal organizations that actually are front for the recruitment and indoctrination of new fighters, are working among the young population that are the most vulnerable population for their teachings, and they're actually focus group. The Balkan has been in the focus of drafting of their militant Islamic extremism 2 decades ago, and we remember the case of Jabrin in 2007 that was attack on the U.S. Embassy in Sarajevo in 2011. The number of people from the region who have joined the foreign fighters in Syria and Iraq is not clear still. Even more with the new conflicts in various Middle Eastern countries, we have confirmed a long-term cooperation that exists between the extremists in the region. I'm referring to the Kosovo and Metohija, Central Serbia, Serbia proper, Macedonia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Montenegro, Albania. And they have caused a lot of people to leave this territory and to join these military groups. Also, we have additional threats that exist in the Balkans. One significant number of extremists left the Balkans and went to European Union, and where they have become residents of different European Union states, and they have established links with the Islamic structures that exist there, and some of them even became leaders who have a strong ideological influence on their on other people in the Balkan region, and they are constantly teaching and promoting the participation of people from this region in jihad. I would like to mention an example of young people, jihadists from Serbia, who have lost their lives in Syria because they have been truly committed, dedicated to the Sharia values. And they belong to various Wahhabi and Salafi fractions, and initiators and former leaders of these associations have been focused mainly on missionary work. And I would like to say that these young people want to prove themselves. They want to prove that they're truly oriented towards the strong activism and proper Islam, at the same time that they're capable of performing terrorist acts. They are a constant threat to various countries because now they're acting on their own. They're lone wolves as terrorists. They're self-organized. And this self-organization is sometimes a consequence of the usage of the mass media, in which the jihadists have invested a lot of means. And along with the traditional mass media outlets, television and radio station, one of the most widespread methods is the internet and the social networking. In the end, we should not neglect the fact that the extremism and terrorism is linked with the organized crime and the poverty of the region. We have not found the exact link between the increase in the migration and the terrorist threats, but nevertheless, the Republic of Serbia is investing constant effort in fighting terrorism by adopting a significant number of pieces of legislation and by adopting the various standards and obligations from the European Union. We are trying to strengthen our system of fighting terrorism. We are trying to focus on the preemptive and prevention. The Security Information Agency is working mainly on the prevention by trying to track down the individuals and groups that are linked with the international and regional terrorist networks, as well as to identify the persons who are constantly residing in the war-torn or war-affected regions and are using Serbia as a transit country. At the same time, we know that we can do a lot by timely and increasingly continually exchanging information on possible plans and intentions of individual groups in organizing the execution of some terrorist acts on the territories of various countries. And we can exchange data about the financing and the organization's leaders. In the end, and it's very important to say that for the successful eradication of this phenomena, we have to engage all segments of our society in this fight. We have to do it thoroughly, both on the national and international level. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Đorđević. And now I would like to give the floor to Sulejman Ugljanin, member of the National Assembly, who will speak on the problem of foreign fighters in this capacity of the President of the National Council of the Bosnian National Minority. We are very glad to have you with us, Mr. Ugljanin, and please, you have the floor.
Honorable Chairman, honorable members of the Parliamentary Assembly of NATO, esteemed colleagues, MPs, dear guests, I've got a great honor and satisfaction today to address this gathering in the capacity of the President of the National Council of Bosniaks and as a chairman of the minority parliamentary group, Bosniak minority in this assembly, to whom belong the national ethnic Bosnians, Albanians, and the on behalf of the Bosniak of one small European people, I'd like to express gratitude to the organizers for giving me opportunity to speak on this extremely important issue. I'm at the head of the Democratic Party of Democratic Action of Sanjak, who was established in 1990. Bosniak in Serbia for 25 years are active in this republic through the activity of this party and Bosniak National Council, which is the highest body of Bosniaks in Serbia. One of the main goals of our party is advocating for and promoting European and Euro-Atlantic integration, and in favor of that we've got the support of the Bosniak people for 25 years now. We think that the Serbian membership in the European Union and Euro-Atlantic integration and organizations enable us to have the security, stability and cooperation in the region, which is in the interest of Bosniaks who live in this region. By opening the EU Serbian membership in negotiations means attaining of our objective and a means for us to be satisfied and happy. Bosniaks are benevolent, civilized, cultural, responsible, aware and well-organized people who, since the fall of communism and introduction of multi-party system, has got its own party and its national council, through which these people try over 25 years now to exercise its rights through the institution of this state system. Today we face one very serious phenomena, and that is a great concern to us. This is the phenomenon of the foreign fighters that go to the Middle East, to Syria, North Africa and Ukraine, and that are also a threat to the for the whole Europe and the whole world. According to the information of the media, over 4,000 people from the European countries have been registered now as the participant of the war in Syria. The media also provide us with the information that some people from Serbia are registered on the list among these fighters. And the overall feeling of the people in Sanjak is very negative concerning this phenomena, and in regard of this phenomena in general. As a leader of the Bosniak National Council and the largest political party in Sanjak, I work daily in the field, and nobody in Serbia does not have better understanding of the developments and of the environmental atmosphere than me. And people from my electoral bases are asking me why the young people go and join the war in Syria and in the Middle East. Parents are very much concerned for their children, and they ask us to find the answer for this problem and ask us to find the solution how to uproot these negative and very malevolent developments. neither me as a political leader of the Bosniaks nor people in the region do not know the reasons for such phenomena, for such developments, and it's clear that behind of these the reason for this could be found in foreign influence. Since I'm at the head of the most important representative body of the Bosniak in Serbia, I have the obligation, the responsibility to find a way to protect the culture and tradition of these small people from the spiteful and malevolent influence coming from abroad, from external source. And I think that the state has the responsibility and obligation to assist in this matter. There are cases when young people in search of jobs, in search of work, are going to the Western Europe, and they become target of some recruiting centers who send them further. The Republic of Serbia has mechanism and possibilities to search into the data, who are the organizations who recruit our children and send them to fight abroad. And I contacted some competent state bodies and asked for the concrete data. Therefore, it's necessary to open more jobs, especially in the 46th, the less developed municipalities in Serbia, where we have 930,000 people living, and the representatives of minorities mostly live there. After the floods we had last year, the number of the unemployed doubled, and actually they are looking for job abroad. And here the international community and the European should take care of this problem. And investment into the underdeveloped region is the way to help and assist young people to find jobs at home, at their places of abode. And in that way we can prevent these malevolent phenomena that are really detrimental for our country and for the region and for the whole Europe and the world. Among the Bosniaks there is a very evil phenomenon, and that developments are the source of concern, because some of the Serbian media and irresponsible political officials spitefully try to connect the whole Bosniak people with the extreme criminal organization who participate in the theaters of war in the Middle East and in Syria. All the heads of the religious societies are unanimous and that the ISIL and a similar organization have no connection with Islam. This organization desecrates our religion and bring the enormous evil to the all the Muslims. We are against religious chauvinism, national fascism. We are against social racism as a source of every evil. We are against the use of force and violence in order to reach political goals and to impose political solutions. The Bosniaks themselves were the victims in the wars in ex-Yugoslavia of the injustice, phenomenon of killing, and therefore they have moral obligation to voice their special sensitivity to killings and mistreatment of people. Therefore, today I address this gathering, esteemed members of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, the organization which is a garant since it was established, garant of the international peace and order. And I invite you and I address you and I urge you to give unanimous answer to all similar phenomena that are the threat to international peace and security. These developments are not and cannot be something that should be misused in daily political conflicts. It's unnecessary to unblock the approach of national minorities to allow them to more easily access the media and to inform them about the detrimental effect of such phenomena and misuse of their religious feelings. Being the president of the Bosniak National Council and president of my party, I am sure that by our unanimous activities we can prevent such events. Thank you very much.
Uglanin. And now I would like to invite Mr. Ezade Echimovic, editor of OBN TV in Bosnia and Herzegovina, to make his presentation. Mr. Echimovic has been at the forefront of reporting on the problem of foreign fighters leaving the Western Balkans for conflict in the Middle East. Please, you have the floor.
My name is Ezade Echimovic. I am an investigative journalist and I will speak only in my own name. I will share some result of my investigation 2 years into this topic and I will use some pictures to make it more interesting for all of us. The phenomenon of foreign fighters attracted global attention only after thousands of Westerners joined the Islamic State group after their declaration of Khilafat, because of rapid development of threat to security. But this phenomenon is not new and it is not far away from us. This picture was taken just 201 kilometers from Belgrade in one village called Gornja Mauča, just recently on February 4th this year. And I will explain how this trait was developed during previous year and previous decades also. This is the cover page of my book. I have published the first book on this topic in 2006 in Sarajevo and later in 2009 in Belgrade. And I will try to prove that this is not a new phenomenon for Balkan. Just for example, those pictures are coming from one collection taken by Federal Bureau of Investigation during a search of premises of Benevolence International Foundation. In first picture we will see Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan with some fighters in 1989, and later those fighters gathered around some of their leaders. But later we will find them in the during the same collection of photo in one small municipality in Bosnia and Herzegovina just in 1992. Actually, we can talk about the same group of people who just after war in Afghanistan was finished moved to new conflict in order to achieve their own goals. It was during that they have made some war crimes, and it is important to understand that we are recalling this memory just to point that encountering with the phenomenon of foreign fighters was already our common challenge during previous years. It is still a challenge for judicial authorities to investigate and prosecute war crimes committed by foreign fighters in this region. War crimes issue is still damaging attempts of reconciliation and political cooperation in this region. And that is why it is important to remember that we are marking 20 years of signing Dayton Peace Agreement this year. It is important to draw one parallel. Without successful implementation of military provision of Dayton Peace Agreement through NATO military intervention in Bosnia, which started in December of '95, groups like Al-Qaeda, Islamic State or Ansar al-Sharia could be able to establish stronghold in the mountains region in different areas. If there was no NATO military intervention in December of '95, today Western soldiers would fight against Islamic State and other groups like Al-Qaeda established in the Balkan area. Withdrawal of all foreign forces was a precondition for deployment of NATO forces. It was actually stipulated in Annex 1A of Dayton Agreement, and it was successfully done. But just to illustrate that it was successful, this is one message from Zenica sent to London on December 16, '95. Sorry, but it is true. Bosnia is over. Recall all brothers to London. It means that someone is informing someone in London that all foreign fighters should be withdrawn from Bosnia because jihad in Bosnia is over at that time, because local national leaders of Bosnian Muslims accepted Dayton Agreement. And this is the meaning of this message, actually recorded by Bosnian intelligence service at that time. We have had during war in Bosnia 886 registered foreign fighters in the BH army. We saw so many things, and we can talk about it, but the most important thing is that during the Bosnian war this movement transformed in something else. We are talking about transformation of so-called Sahwa movement, and I can talk more about it if you are willing to listen, but the most important thing is how trade transformed during years. We have had during our wars in Balkan foreign fighters from different European countries. Now we have after war in Bosnia and wars in Balkan region, foreign fighters from Bosnia and other countries participating in foreign wars. Small groups of foreign fighters from Bosnia went to second war in Chechnya in 1999. Only one foreign fighters with ethnic origin from Bosnia was registered in Afghanistan after 2001. And only one foreign fighters from Bosnia and one from Macedonia were registered in Iraq after 2003. No more than a dozen, we have no more than dozen known cases of foreign fighters from Balkan region from 1999 to 2013. After 2013, there are more than 300 foreign fighters as Bosniaks from Serbia and Bosnia participating in war in Syria and Iraq. We have also more than 300 foreign fighters as Albanians from Albania, Macedonia and Kosovo fighting wars in Syria and Iraq. And also we have a few cases of converts from Serbian, Slovenian or Croat ethnic groups or citizens of Slovenia, Croatia or Serbia who are not Bosniak or Albanian. In many cases we can establish a link with wartime activities, and that's why I'm speaking about this link. First, there is a small group of dozen local fighters with previous military experience from Bosnia, and they are now foreign fighters in Syria. It is the most important group, but it is a small group, and many of them are acting as recruiters. Also, on the ground in this region, we can talk about ex-training center for religious education held by foreign fighters during war in Bosnia, like for example village Oshve, transformed through years in isolated mountain base for recruitment of new foreign fighters. Now, as the one of the most important motivation for these usually young men, but not so young. Probably average is more than 30 years. So they are talking mostly about their sense of creation of Islamic homeland or Khilafat as the most important, the most important motive for participation in those wars in Iraq and Syria. For me, there is no doubt that recruitment processes enabled mostly by existence of a network of so-called Sunnah masjid throughout the region. It means not just countries from Western Balkans outside of European Union, but it means from border of Albania and Montenegro through Austria and different countries. It means from Kosovo to even north of Italy, and they are establishing such network in order to make more recruitment. Second and most important group of foreign fighters from this region is related exactly to network of so-called Sunnah masjids. The largest number of fighters were linked to one of such a community. In this example, it is a community in village of Gornja Mauča. Also, during previous years, many regional missionaries and activists visited this village for different purposes, and we can talk about this community as one of key points for recruitment during previous years. There are also several similar masjids in different parts of Bosnia and region. In many cases, we can make a direct link of foreign fighters from this region with any of these masjids throughout the region. And for me, it is the single most important link which we can make. Also, at the beginning I have talked about Afghanistan and Bosnia connection through people. Now those foreign fighters are making new transnational and cross-border cooperation and engagement group for engagement. Leaders of this group were engaged in networking of members of group from Montenegro, Albania border to Austria and other. We can find, for example, one of leader who traveled more to foreign countries than a foreign minister of Bosnia, according to prosecutor in Sarajevo. New targets also. These preachers and missionaries are trying to take away Islamic legitimacy from official Islamic community and religious leader. In their narrative, Islamic community, official Islamic community, and the state leader of countries like Saudi Arabia are now the main target. It was their attempt to take away Islamic legitimacy to them, and it is actually very serious attempt. Also, United States of America and the Islamic Republic of Iran are often in their narrative presented as pair of great Satan. If we are talking about key factors for mobilization of foreign fighters in this region, we will find, for example, a very high level ideology of Islamic eschatology. After that, for me, the most important reason is we are talking about fatwas is issued by important religious leaders and Islamic scholars in this region also. Interpretation of sectarian conflict in Iraq and Syria is also very high for their motivation. Call to move into Islamic homeland for greater religious freedom as a kind of hijrah. It is also a religious term, and this is a very important motivation for some of foreign fighters. But if we are making analysis of mobilization in this region, for me the most important reason is prolonged recruitment through network of Sunni masjids. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Echimovic. And now, last but not least, it's my pleasure to invite Mr. Raffaello Pantucci, Director of International Security Studies with RUSI in the United Kingdom. Mr. Pantucci is an old friend of our Assembly and has addressed our meetings on several occasions. So this is another occasion. So you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for that generous introduction. It is a pleasure to be back again. And thank you to the NATO Parliamentary Assembly for the invitation and to the Serbian Parliament here for hosting us. I'm going to talk a bit about the phenomenon of foreign fighters. And a lot of what I have I'm going to discuss has already in some ways been raised by Mr. Hechimovic's excellent presentation before and has been touched upon in some of the earlier presentations. But what I'd like to do is put the question of foreign fighters in a bigger context. To talk a bit about sort of some of the people that are going, some of the patterns and trends that we've seen, to then talk about why it matters and why it's a particular concern that policymakers in Europe and within the NATO community should be worried about, to talk a bit about ISIS, and then finally offer some ideas for what might be done, and in particular what might be done in a useful format like this, the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. So first of all, to touch upon the phenomenon and its history. As I think Mr. Hechimovic quite correctly pointed out, foreign fighters are not a new phenomenon. We have had foreign fighters going back not only to the conflicts in the Balkans, but even earlier than that. We can look at the conflicts in Afghanistan, we can look at conflicts in Kashmir, we can look at conflicts in Chechnya, and even before that, we can think back to the Spanish Civil War. The great writer George Orwell was, in his own way and his own time, a foreign fighter. And it's important to remember this, partially because there is a tendency, I think, by policymakers and politicians sometimes to very much focus on this as a brand new phenomenon. It is something that's been happening for a very long time, and there are things we can learn from the past that might help us deal with the problem today. But nowadays, when we're talking about the phenomenon of foreign fighters, there really are sort of two conflicts that are drawing people in. The conflicts in Syria and Iraq, and the conflict in Ukraine. Now, my presentation will focus mostly on what we've seen happening with Syria and Iraq, though I think Ukraine is important to remember because I think some of the problems and expressions of sort of blowback from foreign fighters that we'll see from Syria and Iraq could also express themselves from the Ukraine to some of the countries that we've seen people going from there. So to talk a bit about the sort of profile of individuals who are going to go be foreign fighters. Now, my own research focuses very much on what we see happening in Western Europe, but my understanding from looking at research and talking to colleagues doing similar work in other countries is that this speaks more broadly to the phenomenon elsewhere. And there is no single profile of individuals who are being drawn to be foreign fighters. If we talk about the British context, where I've done a lot of my personal research, we can see that we have had everything from very young teenagers, including teenage girls as young as 15 or 14 or 15, being drawn out there, all the way over to middle-aged men in their sort of 50s. The overwhelming majority tend to be grouped in the age group of 18 to 30 and tend to be male. But the point is that it is a very broad community, and there really is no single profile. We see people going who are born Muslims. We see people going who are converts for some time, or very recent ones. It's a very, very broad community that we're talking about. And that's important to remember when you're trying to figure out how to sort of develop countermeasures to prevent this sort of problem and to prevent its sort of spread. I think on the other side of the equation, there really is also no single narrative that can really be talked about in terms of why people go. In looking at individual cases in the United Kingdom, for example, or in other European countries, we can see that people are motivated. Often they talk about a sense of injustice being done, and a sense of injustice happening in Syria and Iraq, and nothing being done about it by Western governments, and therefore feeling that they should go and do something about it. But we also see people being motivated by some of the themes that Mr. Hachimovic was talking about, the ideas of hijra, of going to emigrate to a new Muslim land, and to sort of help build an Islamic state. And I'd argue that that narrative is an interesting one that we see has been increasing recently in terms of the draw of people to Syria and Iraq in particular. We see people who are going out there to atone for past sins. There's been a very interesting phenomenon in terms of criminals, people with criminal pasts who will sort of come out of prisons or will even radicalize in prisons and will go out to Syria and Iraq as a way of sort of atoning for what they did in their past. Now, some of these people do seem to be genuine in their attempt to try to redeem themselves for what has happened in their past. Others seem to be more on the sociopath end of the scale and are sort of drawn by the idea of going to participate in a battlefield and the sort of excitement around that. There is also a lot to be said around what has sometimes been termed as the jihadi cool factor. This is, I think, what very much is particularly interesting with ISIS in terms of how they've managed to sort of raise the profile of the concept of jihad and going to fight in Syria and Iraq, in that they make it very attractive and they make it very sexy. And so for young people who are sort of looking around to try to find some understanding of the world and some sort of motivation, the idea of going to participate in the construction of this Islamic State, where you'll get to go train in a camp, you'll get to run around with guns, you'll get to meet lots of interesting people, and in some cases even meet partners, it's very attractive, and it's a sort of message that the group has managed to project and quite effectively has managed to draw some people in. But again, to track back to my other point, the narrative question is a very complicated one, and it really does boil down to individuals, and their personal sort of motivations. When we're trying to understand what is drawing people out there, within a British context, what we've noticed is that if you tend to look at the individual biographies, you will find that people tend to have experienced some sort of blockage. Something doesn't seem to be happening in a way that they were hoping to in their own personal lives, and this leaves them with a sense of disenfranchisement with the sort of world around them, and leaves them prone to exploring the ideas of that we see Islamic State and other groups in Syria and Iraq advancing. And then finally, to touch upon the sort of numbers question within the context of sort of foreign fighters, I think as our speaker, Mr. Georgievich, mentioned before, numbers are horribly unreliable. I think the official numbers that we see circulating at the moment is that somewhere in the region of, I think, 20,000 or 10,000 foreign fighters have gone to Syria and Iraq. But I would emphasize that these numbers are are estimates, and they're estimates that are based mostly on people's assumptions based on what they see. If I look again at the British case in particular, just to use it as a sort of case study of numbers, officially the government says that there are 600 to 700. The security services will say that they've identified around that number, so they have names attached to individuals that they know have gone. But when you talk to some more branches of the security services, they will say, we actually think the number is about double that. Because we look at the patterns, we look at the trends, we look at where they're coming from, and we think that it's probably more than that. And I think that is something that probably applies, that does in fact apply to a lot of other contexts. But I think what is interesting is we have started to see people coming back. And again, I think the numbers of people coming back, the returnees, is increasing. And this in some ways brings me on to my next point. well, before I come to sort of the why matters question, I would like to talk a little bit about sort of bringing the phenomenon of narratives and some of the particular issues that we see nowadays that are important around foreign fighters in Syria and Iraq. First is this question of ISIS, or Islamic State, or Daesh, or however you want to call it. What is new about them in some ways is the fact that they have managed to create this image of creating an actual state. This is something that we had not seen happen before. Al-Qaeda and other groups had spoken about doing this, but had never actually succeeded. And this is novel, and this has changed a little bit the narratives. And that's why I mentioned before that the sort of narrative before about clash of civilizations and people seeing a sense of injustice happening and something needing to be done about it has now somewhat evolved into this idea of going to see this Islamic State and going to participate in its construction. I think the other thing that is new, and I think is particularly concerning for countries within the NATO or Western Europe or European NATO context, is the sort of ease of access to the conflict in Syria and Iraq. And ease of access expresses itself, I would argue, in two particular ways. On the one hand, it is simple proximity. You know, I mean, we're talking with a conflict here in Syria and Iraq that is on Europe's borders. And again, to mention the conflict in Ukraine and the sort of foreign fighter question we've had there, that again sits on Europe's borders. And so the problem of people going there and the accessibility of it is something that is much easier than, for example, the conflicts in Somalia or Afghanistan that we saw before. If you were a young Westerner who was excited by the ideas of jihad and wanted to go and fight in Somalia, it was actually quite a difficult prospect to do. Whereas nowadays, if you are trying to go to be a jihadist in Syria and Iraq, get yourself to Turkey, and it's, you know, a journey across a border to get in from there, or Lebanon and going in from there. The other side of the equation is the aspect of social media and the internet, and the way that groups like ISIS and others have managed to sort of use the internet to really advance their sorts of ideologies and make them so very widely disseminated that it's very easy for people to access it. If I'm a young person sitting here in Belgrade and I'm curious about jihad, it's very easy for me to go online and to make contact with fighters who are actually out there and to actually have sort of conversations and actually facilitate your sort of travel out there. So these things have just made the whole conflict so much easier and so much more accessible. Now I'd like to touch a bit upon the question of why this matters. I think the first one to point out, and it's something that people often forget, is that conflicts that have foreign fighters going to them are longer than conflicts that do not. So whenever we see a battlefield that has had foreign fighters going to it, it has ended up taking longer to conclude than a conflict that did not have foreign fighters in it. There's a question of causalities here about whether it's the foreign fighters that are prolonging it, or whether it's because the conflict is prolonged that's drawing foreign fighters in, which is an interesting one, but at the same time it's an important point to make. The other one is the question of course, terrorism and blowback. And this, I would argue, comes back in a number of different ways. In the first instance, we can see the problem of directed plots. Now, what we've seen in the past is that battlefields that have had foreign fighters going to them have ended up with groups on the ground seeing these foreign fighters as useful tools to launch attacks back at the countries that they came from. The July 7 attacks in London are a perfect example of this. You had individuals there who went out originally to Kashmir to fight jihad there, were drawn instead to Afghanistan, from Afghanistan connected with Al-Qaeda, and ultimately were directed by Al-Qaeda to launch an attack in the United Kingdom. They're essentially tools, and the groups see them as useful tools to launch these sorts of attacks. Then there is the question of self-starters, lone actors, or lone wolves as they're sometimes referred to. This is a phenomenon where we can see, and again, it's something that we've actually already seen itself express itself from Syria and Iraq, where we've seen that there have been individuals who've been out there, who've received some training, who fought on the ground, who will come back and decide to launch attacks very much under their own steam, without any seeming direction from any organization out there. They sort of go out there, they have the experience, they come back home, and they decide that it's their duty, for whatever reason, to launch an attack within their country. The attack in Brussels, done by Mohammed Merah, where he shot up a Jewish museum, killing 4 people, is, I think, an example of this that we've already seen happen connected to Syria and Iraq. Then we have the problem of a sort of radicalization, broader radicalization that happens. When these foreign fighters go out there, they develop some sort of credentials, and they sort of become individuals who have a certain level of respect and can command a certain level of respect amongst the community. And what ends up happening is that they can come back and become kind of the new radicalizers that spread jihadist ideas amongst their communities and help other people both go out there and fight, but also more broadly sort of help develop stronger links to jihadist organizations. These individuals become a problem in terms of societal tensions. They will sort of advance extremist ideas, and this can cause tensions within communities in terms of the far right reacting negatively to them, or in terms of just amongst their own communities causing instability. And then there is the other problem of individuals who come back suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. We have a question of, you know, if you're a soldier and you go fight in a foreign country because you're commanded to, when you come back home and have issues with PTSD, there's a structure in place that can sort of help you reacclimatize to society. If you're a foreign fighter, this does not exist. And these sorts of people can present potential problems. Looking at a sort of larger level, and I think this is particularly important to mention within the context of the Middle East and North Africa, is the question of blowback on a larger scale. If we're looking at some of the North African countries that have had foreign fighters going to Syria and Iraq in particular, I'm thinking particularly of Libya, Tunisia and Egypt, we can see that there are quite large numbers, and these quite large numbers are coming back to countries, when we're looking at Libya and Tunisia in particular, where the security structures are having a certain amount of not necessarily able to totally manage their situations and may confront potential situations of thousands of these people coming back. If we look at history, we can see that sort of large numbers of foreign fighters coming back to countries like this has caused substantial instability in these places. And then I would point out, within this context, to mention the case of Ukraine, where we can see again that we've had a sort of unknown number of foreign fighters going there. If these people come back with some of the narratives that they've imbued, be they separatist or be they far right, these can have similar problems in the countries that they are returning to. I will leave talking about ISIS in any great detail, and I'm happy to come back to it in questions, but what I will say about ISIS is that when we're looking at the conflict in Syria and Iraq, it's important to remember that ISIS isn't the only story that we should worry about. When you're talking about what's happening in Syria and Iraq, you must remember that we have, of course, the Al-Nusra Front and other Ahrar al-Sham and other Salafi jihadi groups that are close to Al-Qaeda. And while these groups are very much focused on sort of fighting against the Assad regime in the moment, they do still have the sort of millenarial perspective that Al-Qaeda espouses and do still have a sort of longer-term perspective. And this might present a sort of longer-term threat that we need to worry about. So I'll conclude very briefly by offering some brief points about what could be done, and I think what would be useful particularly to bear in mind within the sort of NATO PA context. I think first, diplomatic efforts and security efforts to conclude the conflicts that we see in Syria and Iraq are very important. Ultimately, the problem of foreign fighters going to these places will continue as long as there are these conflicts happening there. And so bringing these conflicts to some sort of resolution has to be a priority. Intelligence cooperation. This is something that I think has been mentioned before by some of the other presenters, but it is very important. When we're looking at foreign fighters traveling across the European continent, they're crossing lots of countries and borders to get from their native country to the battle zone. And so intelligence cooperation to understand and counter traveling routes is very important. Similarly, weapons smuggling and flows of funding are also very important things that we see coming out of the battlefield or going to the battlefield that require greater intelligence cooperation to be able to effectively counter them. Then there is a question of historical networks. I think it's important to remember that when you're looking at what you're seeing happening in Syria and Iraq, and I think as was mentioned in some of the earlier presentations, it has links back to historical networks. And those historical networks are one that different countries will have different levels of understanding and information about, and so making sure that you've shared that information is, I think, crucial. And then finally, I think the question of ISIS and its particular youth appeal. I think focusing preventative efforts, looking in particular education, and trying to understand how to make the ISIS brand less attractive to young people in a European context is, I think, very important. And I think some work has been done in some member states to do this, and lessons are, I'm sure, applicable elsewhere. So I will leave it at that, and thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pantucci. Now, I would like to give the floor to our colleagues that want to put questions. But I must say something in the beginning. We have 12 inscriptions. So I think that it lasts only 1 minute for each question. If there is anyone that wants to put a question. Okay, so let's start and be rigorous about time. First, Mr. Ali Riza Alawin, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I would like to thank all presentations. It's a valuable presentations. So Turkey has designated Daesh as a terrorist organization since 2005. Under previous, a lot of names, Daesh is organized, and under the lack of authority on the northern part of Iraq and Syria, Daesh is grown. In October 2013, it was named as the Islamic State of Iraq and Levantan. As Mr. Puntanci says, it was organized, very, very organized. They attacked Turkish consulate in Mosul, and they kept 50 innocent people, including children, 3 months of children. But Daesh was controlling the border, Iraq and Syria, and supplying all the logistics to the Assad regime coming from Iran. It was Daesh. So Daesh is a symptom. Daesh is a conclusion. It is not a reason. The reason is the lack of authority in Iraq and in Syria. And the Assad regime is, as long as there is an Assad regime over there, maybe we can remove Daesh, but there will be another organization will remove because of the fruitful environment in the region. When it comes to the foreign fighters, Turkey has designated a no-entry list since 2011 when the Syrian crisis erupted. We have 12,500 people put on this list, and almost 1,150 persons was captured and deported to outside. We have 900 kilometers border. We increase our patrol and all the securities, but there are a lot of people are coming from Europe. As long as they carry the valid passport from European countries, as long as we are not informed intelligently, we cannot do anything to our European citizens.
And the question is?
So my question is, it is very hard for the time being to handle this problem. It needs a strategy. I have no question, Mr. President. This is the explanation. I want to make a comment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, my friend Aliza Rizabovin. Second is Mr. Paul Trajanov from former Yugoslavia Republic of Macedonia. You have the floor.
Thank you very much.
I believe that we should underline that all Balkan states should build up a joint platform, a common platform, in order to protect the interest of our states and to prevent our citizens from going to Iraq and Syria. It's not enough that we have adopted more stringent regulations, we have amended laws. I think that this is an extreme ideology that will be followed up by a new, also extreme energy. It's an everlasting process. So we have to focus our attention on the prevention. We have to educate our young people. We have to prevent the influence of different organizations. We need to improve the educational system, and to prevent organizations from influencing young people to leave our countries and go to these conflicts. So in order to build this platform, we need cooperation. I would like to ask a question to Mr. Pantucci, to pose a question. What is happening in Islamic State? What is the solution? Is it a solution to act with military means, or there is some kind of diplomatic means that can be used, peaceful solution to this threat, the threat of Islamic State and its spreading?
The floor. Now Mr. Corin Natai-Petian from Ermet. Of the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's not secret that many foreign fighters who fight in Syria and Iraq have come from friendly states. In this regard, often it is not so comfortable to criticize each other's inaction. Yet it is essential to take measures to investigate these sources of income of terrorist organizations and to take appropriate measures. Terrorist organizations cannot operate so smoothly without stable source of income. Continuous brutalities and beheadings are the message to all of us that one day have potential to upgrade into genocide. It's important not only physically resist but to ideologically condemn activities that tomorrow can turn into genocide. As a nation who survived it 100 years ago and is still suffering from the implications of the horrible events of the Armenian genocide, we always have contended our position about it. Even in the Syrian capital, militant extremist attacks from neighboring countries on the Armenians in Kesap and other regions of Syria and later Iraq made dozens of them to feel the refugee past again after generations. In this regard, I would like to mention that this year, with the centennial of the Armenian genocide, we will commemorate the victims of genocide and call on every nation to join us to prevent future generations from this experience. And my question goes to Mr. Bantucci. What further actions and measures, decisive actions, should be taken from Euro-Atlantic community to cut sources of income of terrorist organizations in Middle East? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now I give the floor to Mr. Sialvush Novruzov from Azerbaijan.
Спасибо большое. Я благодарен докладчику. Это очень важно.
Appreciate the speakers that this is a very important topic for each of the country, and each country has its own opinion, and I would like also to express my own opinion. In the first place, for example, we are adopting the law, or we are improving the criminal code, but we cannot just root out this disease. We have to find the reasons of this disease, the causes that provoke this disease, and that is something that troubles all of us. And if we take a look, this was also mentioned by the speakers, the smaller is percentage of considering religion or ideology. This is more for money, the reason of this is the money or some other reasons. So because of that, I think that we have to find ways to solve this problem. First of all, if there is no conflict, then the foreign fighters does not have where to go, because in Afghanistan there were some foreign fighters, but the conflict was solved. In Afghanistan there is no foreign fighters. They moved to the other position, to the other place. And we also mentioned Islamic country. They say that this is an organization or the country, but it didn't appear just from nowhere. It is a huge army. It is an army of about 40,000 people, and all people know who were the founders of this kind of country or this group. So we have to solve this problem, and we have to point a finger at everyone who is responsible for this. My colleague mentioned what happened 100 years ago, and in the last century,
pilgrimage.
There was a pilgrimage which was proved by the document, and everyone knows about it. And this genocide was recognized. So we have to reveal the occupating country or occupating forces. And if we do not solve such kind of conflict, such kind of problem, foreign fighters will appear all over Europe. They will move from one country to the other country, and we have to resolve this problem, which is not controlled on any territory. In Nagorno-Karabakh, there's a lot of territory which is not controlled. There's a lot of drugs, there's a lot of weaponry, and if we do not control this territory, we will have the problem arising there and existing there. So because of that, if we solve this problem, we will not have foreign fighters in the place.
Ukraine, you have the floor.
I will just use this 1 minute which was given to me. I have only one precise question to Alexander Georgievich. According to Ukrainian data, as for today, in Donbas, we have about 1,000 foreign fighters from the countries of EU and Europe. And the biggest amount of foreign fighters is unfortunately from Serbia, who fight on Afghanian and Donetsk Republic. So please, Mr. Georgievich, do you have any data, any precise data on the exact number of foreign fighters who are fighting in Ukraine? From Serbia.
I would like to give the floor to the members of the table that wants to answer to the questions.
I'm happy to start. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for those questions. I heard two questions directed towards me, and I apologize if I missed others, but please come back to me. I think the first question about ISIS and what is to be done about it in Syria and Iraq, I think it is important in the first instance to remember ISIS history. This is an organization which has been around in one form or another since the 1990s. When Mohammed al-Maqdisi and his student at the time, Musab al-Zarqawi, created a camp in Herat where they were trying to train up an army of warriors to go back to the Levant to topple what they perceived as the apostate illegal regimes there. So this is a group that goes back to the 1990s, and its history can be tracked from then all the way till today. And what we've seen in that time is that the group has sort of grown and shrunk in response to sort of events. So we can see that after the American-led invasion of Iraq of 2003, the group moved in, became part of the insurgency fighting against the Americans in Iraq, and grew and became sort of the dominant feature of that. And it used the name Al-Qaeda in Iraq for a while, and then it changed its name to the Islamic State of Iraq. In about 2006-07, we saw that it really was at its sort of biggest phase. And then what we saw happen was there was the awakening movement, the Sahwa movement, where we saw the local Sunni tribes in Anbar province and in the Sunni parts of Iraq, who sort of rose up and started to reject the group. And then what we saw happen was the group shrunk again. Now then the West left Iraq, and we kind of forgot about this. But the group continued to exist and launched quite horrible attacks. And then when the civil war in Syria took off, we saw that it sort of spread back across the borders there and used that as an opportunity to grow. Why do I say that? I say that because this is important to remember when you're thinking about the group. It is a group that has grown and shrunk over time, and I think what we're likely to see now in a sort of optimal situation is it will start shrinking back again. I think when you're trying to think about what are the sort of longer term solutions for this, they're different when you're looking at Syria or when you're looking at Iraq. When you're looking at Syria, unfortunately at this point, it's very much a containment story. And it's very much a story of trying to make sure that the group is not able to grow anymore in Syria by getting sort of supplies from outside. When you're looking at Iraq, I would argue there's a much more sort of proactive strategy that can be undertaken, and that's very much about helping strengthen the Iraqi government's capacity to deal with the group and to fight the group, and to in particular make sure that the Iraqi government does not go back to the sectarian practices that I think we saw happening under the Maliki government, which I think were why the Sunni populations in Iraq were so willing to let ISIS sort of grow back into their space, because they felt rejected by the Iraqi government. So there's something to be done there. The other thing that's worth pointing out is that, you know, we worry about ISIS as well because we see the brand ISIS sort of going around the world and seemingly attracting others, and having people in places as far away as Nigeria saying that they are sort of part of ISIS as well. Well, I think the important thing to remember about brands is that brands become uncool. They become very attractive for a while, but they lose their attractiveness. And I would argue that failure, and if we start to see ISIS not winning on the battlefield and growing in the way that we saw it growing over the past year, that will make it a less attractive brand, and that will help sort of reduce that side of the equation. But I think a fundamental point which I'll come back to again, which I mentioned in my presentation, is that the problem of ISIS and the problem of foreign fighters there will continue to be a problem while you have the conflicts in Iraq and Syria. And it really is a combination of diplomatic in terms of trying to bring the civil war in Syria to a close, and military in terms of containing the group and preventing it from being able to develop its sort of continue to grow is, I think, very important. That has a military and a diplomatic component to it. On the question of funding, I think funding flows are very difficult in some ways, and I think you know, there are things you can do in international fora. You know, have people and individuals listed so they can't operate in the international banking system is one way of sort of countering it. I think that you know, leaning on some countries, in particular some sort of countries in the Gulf who maybe have a slightly more open attitude to these funding flows than others, getting them to realize that these are a problem are important. But I think funding, it's important to remember when we're talking about ISIS in particular, that this is a group that makes a lot of the fact that it is quite good at self-funding. So they raise a lot of money through kidnapping. They raise a lot of money through stealing assets in Syria and Iraq and selling them, frankly, on open markets. That sort of that's a funding flow which is very difficult to counter through international structures, and in fact has a much more sort of local solution to it, which is about preventing the group from selling its stuff nearby. And I will leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Georgievich.
I'll answer the Ukrainian question that 1,000 people from Serbia are in Ukraine from the territory of the Republic of Serbia. I'm going to tell you that this number has been found out by foreign intelligence agencies. Some of those people really took part in Ukraine, but they returned mostly, and this activity is incriminated in this country according to the criminal code. The majority of those people returned to Serbia. Some of them stayed there, unfortunately. Thank you.
Mr. Uglanin.
Exactly. We got the information from the Turkish representatives that we need a strategy to prevent this phenomena. Then we heard from our colleague from Macedonia that we need regional cooperation. An Armenian colleague said that we need common action, joint action. Azerbaijani friend told us that we should eliminate the sources are actually causes of these phenomena. We must act jointly. When we listen about this problem, we become aware that we've got a common problem, there is a common awareness of that. We should act preventively to counter this phenomena. And it's very useful that we gathered. It's very beneficial here to mention the need to create a strategy. I'd like to tell you, when we look into these people, individuals and their groups, we can conclude that they are marginal groups. And in Serbia, I think that we need preventive action, and that is invest into underdeveloped areas and to enable those young people to find jobs and stay at home. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Now, do you want to say anything? Yes, okay. So, Mr. Echimovic.
Actually, we are talking about a small group transformed from one larger group. During previous years, it was mostly unnoticed in public, but there was split between so-called nationalist and international jihadist and Salafist on several issues in this region. One of the most important issues was debate among Islamic missionaries and activists about takfir during 2007. Takfir is again a religious concept of declaring someone that he is an unbeliever after he was believer. And it means debate, are we talking about Muslim people in this region, or they are not Muslim and they can be targeted by these extremist groups also. So it was a very important debate, and it was related to our security. Also, there was debate among leading Salafists on several issues, including their relation with official Islamic community in different countries, including Bosnia and Serbia. Split among Salafist leaders on their relation with official Islamic community led to creation of network of so-called Sunnah Masjid throughout the region. It is not related only to Bosnia, but also to other countries in the region, making pressure for creation of new Islamic communities based on so-called authentic interpretation of Islam. We have something like that emerging in different countries. In somewhere it is just a Facebook page working on such idea, but I'm sure that it is a future challenge for all of us in this region. We can find also similar development in different countries from Austria, Slovenia to Albania. The masjid where those missionaries preached are not part of official Islamic communities. Actually, those preachers and missionaries are trying to take away Islamic legitimacy from these Islamic communities, and it is a reason for a real concern for some ambassadors and diplomats from different Islamic countries and in this region, and they are trying to speak publicly about rising Islamic radicalism in this region, and why they are trying to make an advance warning about such development, and it is important to listen their voices. Also, I would like to draw your attention to existence of some groups like Kalimatul Haq, working on several countries on such idea, and also recruiting people. During their praxis, they were able to cross border without any problem and to integrate with the different societies and different groups in several countries in this region. And it is important to recognize what is legitimate religious education and what is actually recruitment for something else. And it is very important to make such a difference.
Thank you very much. Now we begin with our list, and now is Mrs. Dusanka Masčiks from Bosnia-Herzegovina.
Gospođa Mrs. Makić is actually in question. Allow me to thank NATO Parliamentary Assembly to raising this very interesting topic and very major topic, and it is a pity that we haven't been discussing that before and that we devoted very short time to it. I've got two questions. One is for Mr. Đorđević. Do the Western Balkan countries have adequate answer to the threat of the radical Islamism, and do you think that the region needs a concrete assistance and help, and where from should it come in order to make it successful? And one question is for Mr. Ugljanin. What should Bosnian political parties need to do in order to prevent the influence of the radical Islamism in the Western Balkans country, in order to avoid the saying Bosniaks marginalize the issue and other glorify these phenomena? What should be done in order to reduce radical Islamism in the Western Balkan countries? Thank you very much.
And now Mr. Edmund Whitbrod from Poland.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much.
Hvala, gospodine predsjedavajući. Hteo bih svim govornicima da zahvalim na izvanrednim govorima i hteo bih u vezi tri stvari da nešto kažem. Govorili ste o motivaciji. Da li znamo koja je struktura grupe stranih boraca? Dakle, da li su motivisani ekonomskim stanjem?
Of life, some kind of adventure, and what is the group, the radical Islamist extremists? If we know what is the structure, then different group need to be treated in a different way. That's my first question. The second point is the finances and the funds. I think it's very important what was mentioned by my colleagues, and I think that it is very important to limit, even if it is very difficult. I remember what we have done, trying to fight with Al-Qaeda. Then the sources of money, it was we cooperated to limit the money, and I think it's very important. And the third point is media, internet, education. That's very good, but you know that today the media also used for education. And the question is, who is educated using such a kind of media, internet? And the question might be what we have done at our school, in our programs, to change the situation, because I think that we are only speaking about it, but we are doing nothing.
Thank you very much.
Hvala, gospodine. Gospodin Diego Carrido iz Španije. Hvala.
I want to focus on the title of this session, Foreign Fighters in the Middle East and North Africa, not in the political reasons of the conflict, on foreign fighters. And my question goes to the panelists in order to answer what is the main reason, personal reason, to motivate foreign fighters to decide to go to the war. They go from Europe to Middle East, and the reason lays in Europe and in Middle East. In Europe, because there is probably a lack of integration of these young people because of economic reasons, or because there are many ghettos in our societies, and in the Middle East because ISIS has a particular nature, because ISIS, different with Al-Qaeda, ISIS has a territorial nature. It's a territorial quasi-state. Because of this nature, probably ISIS has a sexy aspect. What's your opinion about the balance between these two reasons? The sexy aspect of ISIS, territorial aspect, or the lack of integration in the regional countries in Europe? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now Mr. Ivan Bauer from Serbia. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Serbia is a country that was trying to solve the problem of foreign fighters. In 2013, the party that I belong to, a party whose leader is Mr. Rasim Ljajic, has proposed a draft law which could solve the problem. Only a month after the Security Council adopted a resolution on foreign fighters in October 2014, this law was in regular procedure in our parliament, and I have to say that it was supported by nearly all members of parliament, including the representatives of the Bosnian communities who are on the list of the Socialist Party of Serbia. The only party that did not support this law and that has spoken negatively about this law was the party of Mr. Ugljanin. But today, when I hear him speak, I understand that if we are to adopt the similar law today, we would have the 100% unanimous support for this law. As regards a remark of one of my colleagues, this law does not have a name, a surname, or it does not refer to foreign fighters that are participating in conflicts in Syria, Iraq, in Ukraine. It is a comprehensive law that regulates the issue of foreign fighters no matter where they are. I would ask a question to Mr. Pantucci. What has been done so far as regards the legislation and regulative sphere in other countries of the NATO?
Montenegro.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A colleague from Macedonia has asked a question that basically I wanted to ask. I would like to make a remark then. As regards the foreign fighters, we are all aware of the fact that they have different motivation for leaving their countries and joining jihadists. But the most important, or the majority of them are leaving due to their ideology. And Mr. Hachimovic has mentioned this thoroughly in his speech. And to fight with the ideology, to win over ideology, is a very difficult endeavor. It's a very difficult task. It will take us all decades. It's a decade-long fight. And we will try to engage the whole societies. It is a global threat, and we all have to take part in it. The whole region, the whole society needs to take part. It has to improve the quality of the work of the political parties, of the members of the academia, of the religious community, NGO sector, media. They all have to get involved. It is true that we are countries in the region who have adopted different pieces of legislation that are incriminating these actions. And of course, all who are taking part in these fights, or who are joining these militias, have to face the justice. But we all have to bear in mind that the fight will bring us fruit, will be successful only if the society as a whole takes part in this endeavor. Thank you.
Italy.
Grazie. La domanda.
Thank you. My question is for Mr. Pantucci. You told us about the Islamic State and how it is attractive with its ideology. Then there is this sense of injustice with values that go beyond national experience. You also mentioned Ukrainian fighters, where there are cultural and religious reasons as well. You also mentioned the Spanish Civil War to say that the phenomenon is not new. Now, can we say that the basic culture, the fundamental culture of these people who decide to become fighters is Islamic, but it is also Western, because many of them were born in Europe, in European countries. So to what extent do these ideas they have contain the hope for an Islamic state and also the re-emergence of transnationalism dating back to the French Revolution, and this myth somehow is reincarnated in the Islamic State. So maybe in Europe we have a sort of cultural vacuum, and this is why ISIS is so attractive.
Thank you very much. And now Mr. Tevan Pogozian from Armenia. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. My question would be related to the logic of political decision-making process, and on that regard let me just bring with the following description. Definitely for Armenia it's not a secret that situation in the Middle East is coming from its national interest. We have community there which is a result of centennial-old Armenian genocide committed by Ottoman Turks in 1915-1923. And actually, I hope that on this year, April 24, all the world will join us in the recognition and condemnation of this event for the sake of never allowed to repeat it. But this, my point on the political decision-making is coming to the level when sometimes we need to use a map in understanding the country's role. Because it seems like we all know what is the very attractive position for the foreign fighters, where they are going, what is the attraction, but we are not able to come to the political decision to fight this. And an unfortunate situation which is kind of as also mentioned by Mr. Pantucci, that from one side Turkey is acting as a transit route and also for the oil trafficking there, but from another side political decision should be taken in NATO how to fight the city. Or the similar situation. My colleague from Azerbaijan is complaining about kind of a situation which took place in Khojalı, but he's forgetting to mention that his president at that time, Mutalibov, has mentioned that the event has been organized by the Azerbaijanis. They have killed the people and created a situation when the political decision took place to kick off Mutalibov from Azerbaijan. Now it's also forgetting to mention that about 43 countries are providing foreign fighters for ISIS, and Azerbaijan one of them. And yesterday has been mentioning about 2 tourists visiting Nagorno-Karabakh and has been cut it, but he forget to mention that 2 tourists cut the throat of 70 years old Sambat Tsakunyan, Armenian from there, in the same way as ISIS teaching 2 young guys cut the throat. Maybe they have been past the training there. Actually, we always trying to find a political explanation of our situations and decision making. And on that regard, my question to all speakers, specifically on the idea of raised by U.S. Ambassador to NATO, Douglas Lute, who in his report on February, in his interview on February 11, mentioned, "It makes no sense to have a rapid deployed brigade if you cannot take political decision on a commensurate timeline. This too is an element of the readiness action plan, which has not yet been decided." My question to all of them, guys, can you explain what is the real issue on political decision-making process over which it seems we all know the roots, the problems, the cause, but we are not taking a proper action to have a result. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I noticed that our President has an inscription, Mr. José Lelo, but I noticed that he is not in the room. So now I give the floor to members of the table, and I begin with Mr. Echimovic. If you want to, you were the last, now you are the first. If you have any comments.
I will try to make some comments on the issue raised during the Q&A session. First, about regional cooperation among intelligence agency and police. I have talked with several intelligence and police officials engaged on this issue in the region during preparation for this presentation, and they are talking that there is such a cooperation between different police agencies in several countries of this region, no matter that there is a real problem of a complex situation between different countries like Bosnia and Kosovo, for example, because there is no mutual recognition and there is no any official channel for cooperation, but they are using different opportunities to make such cooperation, and it is very important for them to cooperate much more on this issue. Now it is very difficult even to make any kind of cooperation between such countries like Bosnia and Kosovo. Also, police in Bosnia has a similar problem of cooperation between different police agency within one state because of their competing authorities between I guess 16 different police agencies in Bosnia, and it is a problem to make a real answer even during a time of a terrorist attack. We have had a really dramatic situation during a terrorist attack against the US Embassy in Sarajevo, where police officials from 3 different agencies debated who has the right to shoot against terrorists. So it is a very difficult legal situation right now in Bosnia because of competing authorities on such issue. Also, if we are talking about Bosniak politicians, they should answer for themselves, but I think that this issue is very often used in political and national conflict or debate for different political and national purposes, and that is why we can't answer this topic fully, because we are debating who is guilty in which way, and some of politicians are trying to avoid a real and clear answer to this issue. We should talk more clearly and more directly about this threat. And if we are talking about others issue raised during this debate, we can see that there was also a debate about different political parties or different Islamic communities in Serbia and their different answer on such important issue like this one. So we should try to make much more unified approach on this topic throughout the region, not just in one country. Also, I agree with you that ideological motivation is the most important motivation for them, and that it is not true that there are some other social or economic reason behind such recruitation or mobilization. We can find very educated and very rich people recruited for these purposes, and actually if you are talking with people engaged as foreign fighters, they will talk much more about ideological issue, not about any other issue. It is a concept of hijra. It means that they are now moving for different part in order to get strength, to return much stronger as a winner, and that was their intention.
Thank you very much. Mr. Uglanin.
Would like to answer the question to the representative from Bosnia and Herzegovina, Ms. Majkic. I'd like to say that in Serbia, one of the main preconditions for to do something, it is necessary that the state should recognize the electoral will of the Bosniaks who represent their own Bosniak national representatives, and not to elect somebody who is in agreement with the government, and then to enable Bosniak as legitimate representatives to have the access to national, regional, local media, and to talk about that freely as those to whom the people believe. I heard a question also from the delegation of Serbia. He said something that is not true. First, in the first place, the parliamentary group consisting of Bosniaks and Albanians concerning these modification of the criminal law, we declared it malevolent, and we put an amendment to it with the aim to prevent misuse, abuse of this criminal code in conducting terror against Muslims. And due to the inconfidence of the Albanians towards the government, that is another question. We asked that such a law would be adopted, but prevent its implementation until the composition of police forces is not aligned with the national the composition of the people according to nationality, and that we wanted to make the possibility of Albanians and Muslims to be represented in the police forces. We put an amendment in order to prevent abuse of the law and terrorizing against Bosniaks and Albanians. That is what I wanted to tell you.
Mr. Uglanin, and now Mr. Đorđević, you have the floor.
My colleague from Bosnia put a question, and I would like to answer it concerning ex-Yugoslavia area. Yes, there is a cooperation of the security sector concerning the today's subject issue, and that cooperation exists in a broader region of the Balkans. And concerning the assistance, we provide educational and informational assistance, and it is daily carried out. So education in terms of prevention is really important, and it is being carried out in the Balkans, I can say. Thank you.
Mr. Đorđević, and now Mr. Pantucci.
Thank you very much. A lot of questions. To start with the aspect about funding that was mentioned by Mr. Whitworth, I did not mean in my comments about funding to say that it is irrelevant. It is certainly important, and I think a lot can be done at an international level to try to counter some of the funding flows that we see happening. But I think my point is more to say that it is one thing to be done. But these groups tend to be very resourceful and very good at adapting and finding other ways to raise money that are maybe outside our common structures. So doing something about that is important, but it must be part of a bigger picture and a bigger sort of more comprehensive response. To also touch upon the question of what has actually been done on the perspective of education, well, I would argue quite a lot has actually been done. In some countries, a lot of effort has been undertaken, in particular Western European countries, to try to improve the sorts of what we could describe as critical faculties. So when students read things on the internet, for example, they don't just say, oh, well, I saw it on the internet, therefore it must be true, but they understand a little bit better how to sort of look at something critically. And that is, I think, very important, because I think a lot of what you see these groups doing is sort of broadcasting these messages out and people just picking them up and just sort of absorbing it as though, you know, well, I saw it on Twitter, therefore it's true. Well, explaining, well, no, you know, you must understand how you sort of can appreciate, look at things in a sort of critical fashion is, I think, crucial, and I think a lot of countries have done some work about that. To turn directly to the question looking about what has been done in terms of legislation, well, when we're looking at countries like the United Kingdom or France or Germany or even Italy and Spain, who have been dealing with this problem for some time and been legislating against it for some time, what we can see that's happening when they're looking in particular at what's happening now with Syria and Iraq and travelers there, is they're sort of trying to harness and sharpen their efforts to focus in particular on the travel phenomenon. So we see governments trying to legislate against passport stripping, taking away citizens' passports to prevent their ability to travel, to focus very much on that. But I think the important thing to talk about within legislation in a context like this is that, you know, I think there's a lot of countries that didn't used to think that this was their problem, and I think the important thing to note is that we are really seeing foreign fighters coming from across Europe. We've had nationals of Luxembourg die fighting in Syria and Iraq, which is, I think, a first. So, and a country like that does not necessarily have the same sort of legislation. And when we're talking about a transnational phenomenon that requires transnational responses, making sure that countries across the European Union or the NATO space have similar legislation is, I think, very important. So I think sort of raising the legislation that we find in some countries who previously did not see this as kind of their problem is, I think, very important. To touch upon the question of, you know, what is the balance of motivations and attraction, I think that the sort of sexy aspect that I mentioned is very much built on the perception of success. You know, and it's built on the fact that the group ISIS in particular is able to project itself as an entity that has created a state. You know, and it is continuing to sort of win a battle where it is at the forefront of a confrontation against the West. I think sort of deflating this myth is very important because it is in many ways a myth. The group is not really a state. You know, it controls some pieces of territory, but if you look carefully at a map of the areas where it operates, it does not control this whole space, it controls parts of this space, and it is able to project force into other parts. You know, they do a very good job of showing off about how they're able to provide garbage collection or hospitals or other things. But the reality is that these are very localized things that they're able to do, and often it's not for a very long period of time. They do it when there's a camera there, but then as soon as the camera goes away, they don't. So I think the perception of success is, I think, the sexy aspect that they're able to kind of project. To your question about, is it about the one reaction I would have to your comment about it being about a lack of integration is that is not a uniform response. And I think you can talk about maybe lack of integration in very specific contexts of certain countries, but it certainly is not a uniform issue. Because if we look at the profiles of people that are going, some of them are very well integrated people. You know, we had a case in the United Kingdom of nine students who came from middle-class families who were studying in Sudan at a medical university there, who went together to Raqqa to join ISIS or to serve in a hospital there. These came from very middle-class British families. You know, they're very well integrated. They're really part of the sort of fabric of society. So I think integration is not a uniform problem. Whereas, you know, whereas we look at a country like some parts of France, maybe, yes, it can be said that integration does have a specific part of the problem within a specific context. But I think the point is that there really is no uniform explanation for the motivations. And so I think you have to focus on sort of different contexts and understand how it's happening and why it's happening in, for example, Spain versus how it's happening in, for example, parts of the United Kingdom, and tailor-make your responses to those specific places. To the question that was raised by the Italian parliamentarian. I mean, this is a huge question and one that one could write many books about, but I think is a very interesting one. This whole question of, you know, is, and I'm probably paraphrasing a bit here, that this sort of, it's in some ways the myth and this sort of mythology of internationalization and clash that ISIS and the sort of current foreign fighters trends are piggybacking off, and that is something that we've seen consistently over time. I would argue that yes, that's probably true up to a point. You know, I think what we're seeing now in some ways is an expression of a kind of, you know, anti-establishmentarianism, by which I mean a sort of fighting against the system, right? And that always appeals to young people, right? Because young people are really drawn to the idea of, you know, fighting against the system. They like to, you know, buck it, and that's why you see that particular community there. And I think that is true, and I think that there is something to be said for this theory that one hears, that, you know, the current expression of Islamist extremism is in some ways an expression of the sort of consistent struggle that we've seen in the West over time. So go back to the early 1900s and we would talk about anarchists, and then you look through the sort of middle of the last century, you talk about the struggle between the left and the right, and sort of Islamists as the most recent expression of this kind of thing. And I think that's there's probably something to that, but I think what's important to note is that the sort of logic of following that narrative says maybe that, well, there's nothing that can be done about it, it just always will happen, and maybe society will always have its discontents. But I think there is something that can be done in very specific national contexts to try to deal with this problem, to try to prevent people being drawn to these conflicts and drawn to these sorts of ideas, and that does need to be undertaken. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And this is the end of this panel. We have a break for lunch, and I would ask to everybody to begin our work at 2:45 p.m.